Picture a world where the divine feels as close as the air you breathe, where gods and goddesses govern every aspect of life, from the flooding of the Nile to the harvest in the fields. For over 1,000 years, this was the spiritual heartbeat of ancient Egypt, a complex, vibrant tapestry of deities, temples, and rituals that shaped an entire civilization's understanding of the universe. Now imagine waking up one morning to find that entire world has vanished. Every statue, every name, every familiar prayer has been systematically erased, and in its place stands a single, all-powerful symbol, the burning, radiant disk of the sun. This isn't a scene from a fantasy novel or a distant myth. This was the shocking reality one pharaoh imposed upon his people in a religious revolution so sudden and so absolute. It still echoes through the corridors of history as one of the most daring and baffling transformations ever attempted. That pharaoh was Akhenaten, a ruler whose name would become synonymous with heresy and radical change. Often called the heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten didn't just tweak the existing religious order, he tore it down brick by sacred brick and built something entirely new from the ashes. At the height of Egypt's power, when tradition was the very foundation of society, he declared that the countless gods his people had worshipped for generations were no more. In their place, he elevated a single deity, the Aten, a sun disk whose life-giving rays reached down to touch the earth and whose power was absolute. This wasn't a slow evolution of thought. It was a top-down, Chinese letter revolution that overturned millennia of belief in what felt like the blink of an eye. The temples of Amun were closed, the names of old gods were chiseled from monuments, and a new capital city rose from the desert, dedicated solely to the worship of this one strange god. So what could drive a pharaoh to risk everything, to challenge the powerful priesthood, unsettle his people, and rewrite the spiritual identity of an entire nation? What did he hope to achieve, and why did his grand vision collapse almost as suddenly as it began? The story of Akhenaten is more than a historical footnote. It's a profound mystery wrapped in sand and stone, a tale of absolute power, revolutionary ideas, and the immense weight of challenging the divine order. It invites us to explore the mind of a ruler who saw a different truth and dared to impose it upon the world, reshaping reality itself in his own image. As we journey back to the banks of the Nile, we'll uncover not just the events of this astonishing upheaval, but the human drama behind it, the ambition, the isolation, and the ultimate price of a dream that sought to change religion overnight. To understand the sheer scale of what Akhenaten was attempting to dismantle, we need to step back into the world as it was before his reign, a world utterly saturated with the divine. Ancient Egypt wasn't just a society with religion, it was a civilization built by and for its gods. The entire cosmic order, known as Mat, was a delicate balance maintained through ritual, offerings, and a profound relationship with a vast and intricate family of deities. Think of it not as a single faith, but as an entire ecosystem of belief, where every force of nature, every emotion, and every aspect of life was governed by a specific divine power. The Nile River didn't just flood, it was the gift of Hapi. The sun didn't just rise, it was the great god Ra being reborn from the underworld, journeying across the sky in his solar bark. Death wasn't an end, but a transition overseen by Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the afterlife, who awaited the righteous after their heart was weighed against the feather of truth. At the very pinnacle of this celestial hierarchy sat Amun-Ra, a fusion of the hidden god Amun and the sun god Ra. He was the king of the gods, the ultimate source of creation and political power. His main temple at Karnak was not merely a place of worship, it was the single largest religious complex on Earth, a sprawling stone forest of towering columns and colossal statues that grew richer and more powerful with every passing generation. The priesthood of Amun became an empire within an empire, controlling vast estates, directing the economy, and wielding influence that could rival the pharaoh himself. The pharaoh was considered the living son of Ra, his divine right to rule flowing directly from this relationship. To challenge Amun-Ra was not just heresy, it was to attack the very foundation of the state's power and stability. But the divine presence didn't stop at the grand state temples. It flowed out into the homes and fields of every Egyptian. There was Bes, the dwarf god who protected women in childbirth and chased away evil spirits from the household. There was Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess who stood guard over mothers and newborns. If you were a scribe, you might offer a prayer to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. If you were a farmer, you'd look to Osiris for the fertility of your crops. This was a practical, daily relationship. People left small votive statues at local shrines, whispered prayers for protection, and sought oracles for guidance on everything from business ventures to marital problems. The gods were as real and as varied as the people who worshipped them, each with their own personalities, stories, and domains. This polytheistic system had been woven into the fabric of Egyptian life for well over 1,000 years, providing explanation, comfort, and a clear, structured way to navigate a mysterious and often dangerous world. It was a world in perfect, harmonious balance, or so it seemed, a balance that one man with one radical idea was about to shatter forever. Into this world of entrenched tradition and divine order, a prince was born. His name was Amenhotep IV, a name that itself paid homage to the god Amun, meaning Amun is satisfied. For the first decade or so of his life, he appeared to be a conventional heir to the throne, growing up in the unparalleled luxury of the royal palace at Thebes, the very epicenter of the Amun cult. His father was the great Amenhotep III, a pharaoh whose long reign was a golden age of stability, immense wealth, and monumental construction. Thebes under Amenhotep III was a city gleaming with gold, its temples overflowing with tribute, its power unquestioned. The young prince would have been steeped in this culture of supreme confidence, educated by the finest priests and scribes, trained in the rituals and responsibilities of kingship that had been passed down for centuries. Yet behind the gilded facade of his upbringing, scholars have long searched for clues, for any crack in the conventional portrait of the young prince. What could have turned a son of this magnificent tradition into its most formidable enemy? There are no surviving personal diaries or explicit accounts, so we must piece together the puzzle from the art and monuments of the time. Some point to the growing political and economic power of the priesthood of Amun as a potential source of friction. His father, Amenhotep III, had already begun to subtly emphasize the worship of the sun disk, the Aten, as a personal devotion, perhaps as a way to balance the influence of the Amun priests. The young prince would have witnessed this, seeing firsthand that a pharaoh's power, while divinely ordained, could be checked by the very religious institutions that legitimized it. Another theory suggests a more personal, spiritual catalyst. Perhaps the young Amenhotep IV was a genuine visionary, a man who experienced what he believed was a direct personal revelation of a single universal god. The traditional pantheon, with its animal-headed gods and complex myths, might have felt increasingly artificial to him, a cumbersome human invention that obscured a simpler, purer truth. The sun, with its life-giving, all-seeing light, was a tangible force that touched everyone, from the pharaoh in his palace to the farmer in his field. It required no intricate mythology, no statues hidden in dark temple sanctuaries. Its power was immediate, undeniable, and universal. We also catch glimpses of his family life that may have shaped his worldview. His great royal wife was the famous Nefertiti, a woman whose name means the beautiful one has come. She was not a passive queen. From the very beginning, she was depicted as a powerful partner, standing alongside her husband in a way no Egyptian queen had been portrayed before. This partnership suggests a meeting of minds, a shared vision that would fuel their coming revolution. Furthermore, evidence suggests that Amenhotep IV may have suffered from a physical condition, perhaps a hormonal disorder that gave him an androgynous appearance with an elongated face, full lips, a slender neck, and wide hips. In a culture that idealized the strong, muscular form of the pharaoh as a living god, his own body may have set him apart, making him feel different, perhaps even fueling a desire to redefine the very image of divinity itself. So, the man who would become Akhenaten was not created in a vacuum. He was a product of the pinnacle of Egyptian power, yet he saw its flaws and its constraints. He was a prince groomed for tradition, yet he possessed a mind that chafed at its boundaries. He was, in many ways, a paradox, a man who would use the absolute power granted to him by the old gods to destroy their kingdom and build his own in the stark, empty desert, a blank slate for a new kind of heaven on earth. When Amenhotep IV ascended the throne around the year 1353 before the Common Era, the ceremony would have followed a sacred, millennia-old script. He was crowned in Thebes, the air thick with incense and the chanting of priests, his head adorned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He received the royal titulary, his 5 great names, and officially became the living embodiment of Horus, the son of the sun god Ra. To the thousands of dignitaries, priests, and officials in attendance, it must have seemed like business as usual, the seamless transition of power to another son of Amun. But those watching most closely, the high priests and seasoned courtiers, might have detected the faintest tremor beneath the polished surface of the ritual. The new pharaoh, for all his traditional trappings, was already different. The first cracks in the monumental facade of Egyptian tradition appeared not in grand declarations, but in the subtlest of places, the stone walls of the temples he commissioned. In the very first years of his reign, Amenhotep IV began building monuments in Karnak, the holy city of Amun, but the art he sanctioned was unlike anything that had come before. For centuries, Egyptian art had been governed by strict conventions. Pharaohs were depicted as idealized, eternally youthful athletes, their bodies perfect and symmetrical, their faces serene masks of impersonal power. Now a new style emerged. The king's likeness began to show a strangely elongated head, a gaunt face with heavy-lidded eyes, full, pronounced lips, and a slender, almost delicate neck. His torso seemed oddly narrow, with wide hips and spindly legs. This was not the god-king of old. This was a figure with distinct, almost exaggerated physical characteristics. This artistic shift was far more than a simple change in aesthetic taste. In a culture where imagery was a form of reality, where a statue or a carving wasn't just a representation but a vessel for divine essence, altering the image of the pharaoh was a radical act. It was a direct statement. The old ideals of perfection were being rejected. The pharaoh was choosing to be shown as unique, different, and set apart. Some Egyptologists speculate this was a move toward greater realism, perhaps an honest depiction of the king's actual physical features, possibly linked to a genetic or hormonal condition. Others argue it was a deliberate theological statement, creating a new visual language to accompany a new religious idea. By presenting himself as this androgynous, almost otherworldly figure, he was visually severing his connection to the traditional image of kingship and aligning himself with a new, undefined source of power. Simultaneously, a quiet revolution was taking place in the religious sphere. The king began to noticeably elevate the status of the Aten, the sun disk. Initially, he did not outright ban the old gods. That would come later. Instead, he started giving the Aten unprecedented prominence. In temple reliefs, the Aten was no longer just one symbol among many. It was shown receiving offerings directly from the king and queen, often to the exclusion of other deities like Amun. The Aten's name started to be written in a new, unique way, enclosed in 2 royal cartouches, a privilege previously reserved only for a ruling pharaoh. This was a clear signal that the Aten was being treated not just as a god, but as a king in the divine realm, with Amenhotep IV as its sole earthly representative. The priesthood of Amun, the most powerful institution in Egypt after the monarchy itself, would have watched this with growing unease. Every new temple the pharaoh built for the Aten in Karnak was a direct challenge to their theological and economic monopoly. These weren't small chapels, they were massive complexes like the Gempoten, a structure designed for open-air worship of the sun disk, its courtyards flooded with sunlight in deliberate contrast to the dark, enclosed sanctuaries of Amun. The resources being funneled into these projects, the stone, the labor, the precious metals, were resources that were no longer flowing into the treasuries of Amun. The early years of his reign became a silent, high-stakes tug of war. The pharaoh was still performing the necessary rituals for Amun, maintaining the public pretense of tradition, while simultaneously building an entire parallel religious infrastructure right under the priesthood's nose. He was testing the limits of his power, seeing how far he could push before the established order would push back. These initial, subtle changes were the first tremors before a full-scale earthquake, a quiet but deliberate dismantling of a world that had stood for over 1,000 years. Then came the moment that would split Egyptian history into a before and an after. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made his move, and he did so with breathtaking finality. He abandoned the city of Thebes, the religious and political heart of Egypt for centuries. He left behind the grand temple complexes of Karnak, the bustling capital his father had built, and he journeyed north to a blank stretch of desert along the Nile, a place untouched by any previous god or king. There, on the eastern bank, he founded a new capital city which he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. This was more than just a new administrative center. It was a physical declaration of a new beginning, a city built from scratch for one god and one family. The boundary stelae, the great carved markers that outline the city's limits, bore a proclamation from the king himself, swearing an oath to never expand the city's borders and to never leave it, a promise to remain forever in the divine light of his sole god. It was here, in this newly consecrated space, that he made his identity-altering announcement. He was no longer Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. That name was now a relic, a connection to the very deity he was rejecting. He renamed himself Akhenaten, which translates to effective for the Aten or spirit of the Aten. His great royal wife, Nefertiti, also received a new name, Neferuaten, meaning beautiful are the beauties of Aten. This was a profound act of self-reinvention. In Egyptian belief, a name held immense power. It was a core part of a person's soul. By changing their names, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were shedding their old identities and being spiritually reborn as the sole devoted servants of the Aten. This name change was a signal to every corner of the empire. The old way was dead. The theological revolution was now absolute and brutally enforced. The Aten was not merely promoted to the head of the pantheon. The rest of the pantheon was effectively erased. Akhenaten declared the Aten to be the one true god, the universal creator. He was not just the god of Egypt, but the god of all creation, a deity whose dominion knew no borders. In a shocking move, Akhenaten ordered the systematic persecution of the other gods, with Amun and his consort Mut as the primary targets. Royal work crews, the so-called chiselers, were dispatched to temples and monuments all across Egypt. Their task was methodical and thorough, to chisel out the names of Amun, Mut, and the plural word gods from every inscription they could find. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a state-sanctioned program of damnatio memoriae, an attempt to erase these deities from existence by destroying their names and thus their power in the mortal world. The great temples of Amun were closed, their priests disbanded, and the vast flow of offerings and tribute that had sustained them for a millennium was abruptly cut off and redirected to the cult of the Aten. Akhenaten's vision of this new god was as radical as his methods. The Aten was not depicted as a man with an animal head, nor was it a statue hidden in a dark shrine. It was represented solely as a sun disk, a circle from which long rays extended down to Earth, each ray ending in a tiny hand, often holding the Ankh, the symbol of life. These rays caressed the royal family, offering them the breath of life, while the rest of humanity received this blessing only indirectly through the pharaoh. This imagery was a powerful theological statement. The Aten was distant, universal, and unreachable except through its one chosen intermediary on earth, Akhenaten himself. He and Nefertiti became the sole high priests of this new faith. Only they could make direct offerings to the Aten. The people were merely spectators to this divine relationship, worshipping the king who worshipped the god. This created a religious system that was intensely centralized and personal, placing Akhenaten at the absolute center of the cosmos, the indispensable conduit between heaven and earth. The religious bombshell had detonated, shattering a world of 1,000 gods and leaving in its wake the blazing, singular disk of the sun. The renaming of a pharaoh was never a casual act in ancient Egypt. It was a profound declaration of identity and purpose, a rewriting of the soul's very essence. By changing his name from Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten or spirit of the Aten. The king performed the ultimate act of spiritual and political rebellion. In that single gesture, he severed his connection to the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon and publicly cast his lot with a new, singular divine force. To understand the sheer weight of this decision, consider what a name meant in this culture. Egyptians believed a name was not just a label, it was a vital component of a person's being, a magical key to their existence and legacy in both this world and the next. To speak a person's name was to keep them alive, to erase it was to condemn them to a second death. A pharaoh's name, in particular, was a sacred vessel containing the blueprint of his reign, his relationship with the gods, and his divine mandate to rule. For centuries, royal names reinforced this cosmic order. The great pharaohs of the past bore names like Thutmose, born of Thoth, or Ramesses. Ra has fashioned him. Each was a constant public prayer, an acknowledgement that their power flowed directly from a specific deity. Amenhotep's own name was a direct tribute to Amun, the very god whose priesthood now controlled vast swaths of the nation's wealth and influence. To abandon that name was to spit in the face of theological and political convention, a calculated insult to the establishment that had nurtured his own dynasty. He wasn't just changing his mind, he was annihilating his old self and forging a new one in the fiery light of the Aten. The new name, Akhenaten, was a perfect theological slogan for his revolution. Effective for the Aten positioned him not merely as a worshipper, but as the active agent of his god, the one through whom the sun disk's will and power became manifest on earth. Spirit of the Aten went even further, suggesting a near mystical union, as if the king and the god shared a single life force. This was a radical redefinition of kingship. The traditional pharaoh was the intermediary between the people and the gods, but Akhenaten was now positioning himself as the indispensable channel between all of creation and the one true God. The people could not reach the Aten directly, they could only access its life-giving rays through their devotion to him. This move centralized all religious and, by extension, all political power in the hands of the royal family in a way never before seen in Egyptian history. It made him the sole pivot of the universe, the one person who could interpret and enact the divine will. This name change was also part of a broader rebranding of the entire royal household. His queen, the formidable Nefertiti, became Nefer-Neferuaten Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of Aten, the beautiful one has come. Even their daughters received names compounded with the Aten, such as Meritaten, she who is beloved of the Aten. The entire family was being publicly reconsecrated as the holy family of the new faith, a living testament to the power and blessing of their soul. God, every time a courtier spoke their names, every time a scribe wrote them in an official document, it was a reinforcement of the new doctrine. It was a constant, pervasive propaganda campaign woven into the very fabric of daily language and administration. The audacity of this act cannot be overstated. In a single moment, Akhenaten transformed himself from the upholder of tradition into its greatest heretic. He took the legitimacy bestowed upon him by the old system and used it as a weapon to destroy that very system. By erasing Amun from his own identity, he gave moral permission for his teams of workers to erase Amun's name from temples and tombs across the land. His personal reinvention was the catalyst for a national project of theological cleansing. This was more than a change of heart. It was a declaration of war on 1,000 years of history, a war he intended to win by rewriting reality, starting with his own soul. With the theological groundwork laid and his own identity remade, Akhenaten needed a physical stage worthy of his cosmic drama, a place untouched by the footprints of any other god. The result was one of the most ambitious and hurried construction projects in ancient history, the foundation of a brand new capital city, Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. Rising from a desolate crescent of desert on the east bank of the Nile, this city was far more than an administrative seat. It was a deliberate and powerful statement, a spiritual clean slate carved from the wilderness. To understand why he turned his back on the glorious capitals of Thebes and Memphis, we need to see them through his eyes. Thebes was not just a city, it was the heart of the problem. For centuries, it had been the cult center of Amun, a place where the air itself felt heavy with the presence of the old gods. Its labyrinthine temples at Karnak and Luxor were stone embodiments of the very religious and political system he was trying to annihilate. Every priest, every ritual, every whispered prayer to Amun in Thebes was a challenge to his authority. Memphis, the ancient administrative capital, was similarly steeped in tradition, home to the cult of Ptah and a powerful, established bureaucracy. To remain in either city would have meant a constant, exhausting battle against the ingrained habits of his people and the subversive power of the old priesthoods. He needed to sever that connection completely, so he chose a site that was symbolically and geographically neutral, a vast, empty plain roughly halfway between Memphis and Thebes, bordered by tall cliffs that curved like a natural amphitheater. This location was not chosen for its strategic value or its agricultural potential. It was chosen for its purity. No previous temple had ever stood there. No local deity claimed it as their home. It was a blank canvas, and Akhenaten intended to paint his new vision of the universe upon it. He marked the boundaries of his new domain with a series of massive carved cliff inscriptions known as the boundary stelae. On these stelae, he swore a solemn oath before the Aten, proclaiming that the city was the god's own chosen ground and that he, Akhenaten, would never venture beyond its borders. This was a stunning declaration of permanence and isolation, a pharaoh willingly placing himself in a desert-gilded cage of his own making, all for the sake of his god. The scale and speed of the city's construction was staggering. This was not a project that unfolded over generations. It was a frantic, all-hands-on-deck effort that saw a fully functional capital, complete with palaces, temples, government buildings, and residential suburbs, spring up in a matter of a few years. Imagine the scene. Thousands of workers, from skilled stonemasons and artists to common laborers, were mobilized and transported to this remote site. They lived in a hastily built workman's village, toiling under the relentless sun to bring the pharaoh's dream to life. The city was laid out along a grand north-south road, parallel to the Nile, a vast avenue nearly 5 miles long that connected the major official districts. The entire plan was open and linear, a stark contrast to the cramped, organically grown streets of Thebes. This was a city designed for processions and for the unimpeded passage of the sun's rays, reflecting the core tenets of the new faith in its very architecture. The most revolutionary structures were the temples dedicated to the Aten. Gone were the dark, enclosed sanctuaries of the old gods, where only the high priest could enter the inner sanctum to tend to the cult statue. The great temple of the Aten at Akhetaten was a radical departure. It was a sprawling, open-air complex with a series of unroofed courtyards filled with hundreds of offering tables. There were no statues of the Aten, for how could one make an image of a sun disk? Instead, the only focal point was the sky itself. Worship happened directly under the sun's gaze, with the king and queen serving as the sole high priests. The entire design emphasized accessibility to the divine light, but ironically not to the people. The masses could not enter the innermost precincts. They could only watch from a distance as their king performed the rituals. This architectural plan perfectly mirrored the new theology. The Aten's light was available to all, but only the royal family could serve as its direct conduit. Alongside the temples rose the royal estate's vast palaces adorned with vibrant paintings of marshlands teeming with life, a celebration of the Aten's creative power. There was the Great Palace, connected to the king's private residence by a bridge that spanned the royal road, and the North Palace, likely belonging to one of his daughters or his wife, Nefertiti. The homes of the nobility were built quickly, often with rubble cores and stone facades, but they were lavishly decorated with frescoes that broke from all tradition. These scenes depicted the royal family in shockingly intimate moments, Akhenaten and Nefertiti playing with their daughters, kissing them, holding them on their laps. This naturalistic, almost sentimental art was a world away from the formal, ceremonial poses of previous dynasties. It served to humanize the royal family, presenting them as the ideal, loving nuclear unit blessed directly by the Aten's rays, the holy family of a new age. In building Akhetaten, Akhenaten wasn't just constructing a city. He was physically manufacturing a new reality, a theocratic utopia where he and his god could reign supreme, utterly divorced from the history and the people he had left behind. But this revolution wasn't confined to theology and architecture. It exploded onto the walls and statues of Egypt in a visual language so shocking it's still known by its own name, Amarna art. For centuries, Egyptian art had been a machine for producing permanence. Its rules were strict and unchanging, designed to depict not the fleeting world of the senses, but the eternal, perfect order of man. Pharaohs were shown as ageless, muscular, and impossibly serene, their bodies and faces rendered according to a formula that transcended individuality. They were gods in stone, untouchable and remote. Amarna art shattered this mold with the force of a hammer. Suddenly, the royal family was depicted with a jarring, almost unsettling realism. Akhenaten's own form became the template, an elongated skull, a gaunt face with a sharply defined jaw, heavy-lidded, dreamy eyes, full lips, a slender neck, and a strangely soft torso with wide hips, narrow shoulders, and spindly limbs. This was not the idealized warrior king. This was a portrait of a specific, unique, and physically distinct man. This radical shift in style was far more than an aesthetic choice or a sudden appreciation for realism. In a culture where an image held magical and spiritual power, where a statue could serve as a vessel for a god's spirit, changing how the king was depicted was a theological act of the highest order. By presenting himself in this androgynous, almost otherworldly form, Akhenaten was visually severing his connection to the traditional image of kingship. He was creating a new iconography for a new age, one that rejected the old ideals of masculine power and martial strength associated with gods like Amun and Horus. Some Egyptologists argue this was a deliberate fusion of male and female attributes, symbolizing the Aten as a creator god who contained the essence of all life within itself. Others see it as a powerful assertion of his unique role as the sole conduit for the Aten's power, a figure so set apart from ordinary humanity that even his physical form had to be different. The art was a manifesto in stone and pigment, proclaiming that the old standards of beauty and perfection were obsolete, replaced by the raw, unvarnished truth of the pharaoh as the Aten saw him. This new truth extended to scenes of royal life, breaking another 1,000-year-old taboo. Before Amarna, official art showed the pharaoh in formal, ceremonial poses, smiting enemies, making offerings to gods, or receiving the homage of foreign lands. The royal family's private life was a sacred mystery never to be depicted. Amarna artists threw open the palace doors. In a series of stunningly intimate reliefs and statues, we see Akhenaten and Nefertiti as a doting, affectionate couple. They are shown riding in chariots together, their arms wrapped around each other. In one famous scene, Akhenaten kisses one of his young daughters as she sits on Nefertiti's lap. In another, a daughter playfully tugs at her mother's earring while another sits on the king's shoulder. These are not the stiff, formal portraits of deities. They are snapshots of a family filled with movement, emotion, and a tenderness that feels startlingly modern. This was a calculated piece of propaganda, of course. By presenting the royal family as a loving, accessible unit, constantly bathed in the life-giving rays of the Aten, Akhenaten was making his new religion relatable. He was showing that the blessing of the one God manifested itself not just in cosmic power, but in the simple human joys of family life, a blessing that flowed directly through him to his people. The very composition of Amarna art reinforced the New World Order. Traditional Egyptian scenes were meticulously balanced and hierarchical, with figures sized according to their importance. In Amarna art, this rigid structure dissolves into a more fluid and dynamic style. Scenes are often crowded and energetic, filled with a sense of movement. The sun disk, the Aten, is always present at the top of the scene, its long hand-tipped rays reaching down to touch only the royal family, anointing them with Ankh symbols. This created a powerful visual hierarchy, the Aten at the top, the royal family in the middle as the sole recipients of its direct energy, and the rest of the world, officials, soldiers, foreign envoys below, benefiting only indirectly. The art itself was a map of the new theology, with Akhenaten and Nefertiti positioned as the indispensable center of the universe. Even the natural world was depicted with a new vitality. Plants, animals, and birds are rendered with a careful, observant eye, celebrating the Aten's role as the creator and sustainer of all life. This was art in service of a revolution, every chisel mark and brushstroke designed to convince the viewer that a new and dazzling truth had dawned and that its name was the light of the sun. While the temples of Amarna rose from the desert and the chisels erased the old gods' names, a quieter yet equally profound revolution was being inscribed on the walls of the royal tombs. Here, carved for eternity, we find the great hymn to the Aten, a poetic text that many scholars believe was composed by Akhenaten himself. This isn't just a royal inscription, it's a passionate theological manifesto, a window into the very soul of the Amarna revolution, and a piece of writing so strikingly advanced that it has prompted a bold question for over a century. Is this the world's first true monotheistic scripture? The hymn presents a vision of a single, all-powerful creator God so comprehensive and exclusive that it stands in stark contrast to the complex mythologies that came before it. Let's listen to its words as translated from the ancient Egyptian. You appear beautiful on the horizon of heaven, O living Aten, the creator of life. When you rise on the eastern horizon, you fill every land with your beauty. You are bright, great, dazzling, and exalted over every land. Your rays enfold the lands to the limit of all you have made. You are the sun, and you reach their limits and subdue them for your beloved sun. Though you are far away, your rays are upon the earth. Though you are in their faces, no one knows you're going. Right from the start, the tone is revolutionary. This is not a prayer to a god hidden in a temple sanctuary. It is a direct address to a visible, universal force. The Aten is described as the sole creator whose physical light literally enfolds the lands to the limit of all you have made. This is a god of the entire world, not just of Egypt. The phrase, though you are in their faces, no one knows you're going, introduces a theme of divine inaccessibility. The Aten is everywhere, yet its true nature remains unknowable to ordinary people, a mystery that can only be mediated through the Pharaoh, the beloved son. The hymn continues, moving from cosmic praise to a remarkably detailed observation of the natural world as proof of the Aten's benevolent power. When you set in the western horizon, the land is in darkness in the manner of death. Every lion comes from its den, all serpents bite. Darkness prevails and the earth is silent, for their maker rests in his horizon. At daybreak, when you rise on the horizon, you drive away the darkness and shed your rays. The two lands are in festival, awake and standing on their feet. You have raised them up, they cleanse their bodies and take their clothing. Their arms are lifted in praise at your rising. The entire land does its work. This passage is breathtaking in its observational clarity and its theological implication. The darkness of night is not the domain of a rival god like Osiris or the serpent Apophis. It is merely the absence of the Aten. The dangerous creatures of the night are not agents of chaos, but simply part of the natural order that emerges when the Creator's light is withdrawn. The sunrise is a daily act of resurrection, not of a single god, but of all creation. The people waking, washing, and going to work are not performing rituals for multiple deities. They are participating in a universal, daily ritual dictated by the one true God. The Aten provides for all life in a beautifully systematic way. All herds rest in their pastures, trees and plants flourish, birds fly from their nests, their wings lifted in praise to your spirit. All flocks leap on their feet, all that fly and alight live when you rise for them. Ships sail north and south as well, for every road is open at your rising. The fish in the river leap before your face, for your rays are in the midst of the sea. Here, the hymn's creator displays a profound sensitivity to ecology, seeing the divine in the everyday functioning of the world. The bird's flight is praise. The fish leaping in the river are responding directly to the sun's rays penetrating the water. The synchronized rhythms of the animal kingdom, the growth of plants, and even the commerce on the Nile are all presented as evidence of a single organizing intelligence. This is a form of natural theology that would not be out of place in a much later era, finding God not in sacred texts alone, but in the intricate design of the created world. The parallels to later monotheistic texts, particularly the Hebrew Psalms, are impossible to ignore and have been the subject of intense scholarly debate. Compare the Aten hymn's celebration of divine providence to Psalm 104. You make darkness, and it is night when all the beasts of the forest creep forth. The young lions roar for their prey. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to his labor until the evening. The structural and thematic similarities are striking. Both passages move through the cycle of day and night, observing the behavior of animals and humans as direct responses to the divine command. Both attribute all of creation, the dangers of the night and the productivity of the day, to a single omnipotent source. So, does this make the great hymn to the Aten the first monotheistic text? The answer is nuanced. It is unquestionably monolatrous. It worships one God above all others, to the explicit exclusion of all rivals. Akhenaten's persecution of other cults shows he intended this to be an exclusive worship. However, some scholars argue that true monotheism, as later developed in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, involves not just the belief in one God, but the philosophical assertion that only one God exists or can exist. The Aten hymn doesn't explicitly philosophize in this way. It simply ignores all other deities as if they are irrelevant, focusing all creative and sustaining power on the sun disk. Furthermore, the Aten's power is still deeply intertwined with a single human agent, Akhenaten. The people worship the Aten through him. In this sense, it is a monotheism of the Pharaoh, a system where the sole god is so transcendent that he requires a sole, divinely appointed intermediary on earth. Despite these distinctions, the theological leap is monumental. For the first time in recorded history, we have a sophisticated, sustained poetic work that attributes the entirety of creation, from the grandest horizon to the smallest bird, to the benevolent will of a single, universal deity. It was a radical, beautiful, and isolated vision that shone as brilliantly and as briefly as the sun at its zenith, before the long shadows of tradition began to creep back in. Yet to see Akhenaten's revolution as a one-man show would be to miss half the story, for standing beside him at every step was a figure whose influence was so profound it has sparked one of the most compelling debates in Egyptology. Was Queen Nefertiti merely a loyal consort, or was she a power in her own right, perhaps even a co-regent who helped steer this religious upheaval? The evidence carved into the very stones of Amarna suggests she was far more than a beautiful face. From the moment the new art style emerged, Nefertiti was depicted with a frequency and prominence no Egyptian queen had ever enjoyed. While previous royal wives were often shown as smaller, subsidiary figures standing behind the pharaoh, Nefertiti appears as his equal in scale and stature. She stands tall beside him in ritual scenes, her hand raised not in a passive gesture but often mirroring his own, actively presenting offerings to the Aten. She is shown driving her own chariot through the streets of the new capital, a symbol of dynamic action and personal authority. In numerous reliefs, she wears the tall, blue crown typically reserved for the pharaoh himself, a powerful visual statement that blurred the lines between queen and king. This was not the traditional role of a supportive wife. This was the portrayal of a full partner, a co-architect of the new order. Her titles themselves tell a story of escalating power. She was not just the great royal wife, she bore the epithet Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, a political title, and more significantly, Lady of all women, suggesting a defined leadership role. But the most telling evidence of her unique status comes from the scenes depicting the worship of the Aten. In the new open-air temples, there were no ranks of priests mediating between the people and the god. The only figures shown performing the essential rituals, making offerings, burning incense, and chanting praises directly to the sun disk are Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She is repeatedly portrayed in the role of a high priestess, standing alone before offering tables heaped with goods, her arms raised in the precise gestures of adoration. This made her the sole female conduit for the Aten's power, a theological position of immense importance. If Akhenaten was the god's effective spirit on earth, then Nefertiti was its graceful and powerful embodiment, an indispensable half of the divine pair that channeled the sun's blessings to the people. This unprecedented prominence has led many scholars to propose a radical theory, that as Akhenaten's reign progressed, Nefertiti may have been elevated to the status of a full co-regent, a female pharaoh ruling alongside her husband. The art provides tantalizing clues. In several late-period Amarna reliefs, we see a mysterious figure appearing alongside Akhenaten, depicted with the same regalia and scale as the king. This figure is sometimes named as a male co-regent called Smenkhkare, a shadowy individual about whom almost nothing is known. However, a compelling body of research suggests that Smenkhkare and Nefertiti might have been the same person. The argument hinges on the idea that Nefertiti, in her role as co-pharaoh, would have needed to adopt a royal titulary and perhaps even a slightly different name for official ceremonies, much like the female pharaoh Hatshepsut had done centuries before. The androgynous art style of the period, which already blended male and female features, would have made such a visual transition seamless. If this theory is correct, it means that in the final years of the Amarna revolution, Egypt was effectively ruled by a dual monarchy of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, a husband and wife team who were not just political leaders but the two high priests of their singular god. What might have motivated this powerful queen to throw her influence so completely behind such a risky venture? Some see her as a true believer, a theological visionary whose convictions matched her husband's. The fervor with which she is depicted in rituals suggests a deep, personal devotion to the Aten. Her famous bust, with its elegantly sculpted features and serene confidence, hints at a woman of immense intelligence and determination, fully capable of embracing and promoting a radical new worldview. Alternatively, her role can be seen through a political lens. The old religious establishment, dominated by the male priesthood of Amun, offered little power or prominence to a queen. By helping to dismantle that structure and replace it with a new cult where she served as the primary priestess, Nefertiti was in effect carving out a position of unparalleled authority for herself. She became the most powerful woman in Egyptian history precisely because the old rules had been erased. Her partnership with Akhenaten was therefore a symbiotic one. He provided the royal authority to launch the revolution, and she provided the consistent, visible leadership that helped sustain it, becoming the familiar, graceful face of a frighteningly new and abstract god. Without Nefertiti's steadying presence and very public devotion, the austere cult of the Aten might have struggled even more to find a foothold in the hearts of a people who were used to gods they could see, touch, and understand. The revolution now moved from bold proclamation to brutal enforcement, having declared the Aten the one true god and built a new capital in its honor. Akhenaten turned his attention to the monumental task of systematically dismantling the religious world he had inherited. This was not a passive shift in belief. It was an aggressive, state-sponsored campaign to literally erase the old gods from existence, and its primary target was the once almighty Amun. The assault was carried out on three fronts: the physical, the economic, and the psychological, creating a domino effect that left the traditional religious infrastructure in ruins. The most visible and visceral aspect of this campaign was the physical destruction. Across Egypt, from the grand temples of Thebes to the remote tombs of nobles, teams of skilled artisans were transformed into agents of theological cleansing. Armed with chisels and hammers, these work crews embarked on a methodical mission to chisel out the names and images of Amun, his consort Mut, and their son Khonsu from every monument, wall, and statue they could find. They didn't stop there. They even attacked the plural word gods itself, gouging it out of inscriptions to linguistically enforce the idea that only one deity was worthy of mention. This wasn't random vandalism or the rage of a mob. It was a cold, bureaucratic process. The work was precise, often leaving the rest of the inscription perfectly intact, a ghostly blank space where a god's name had once been. Imagine walking through the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, a forest of towering columns covered in sacred text, and seeing these deliberate scars everywhere, a silent, screaming testament to the new orthodoxy. The message was unambiguous. These deities were not just demoted, they were being annihilated from history, their very memory condemned to oblivion. For the average Egyptian, seeing the divine name of Amun, a name that meant the hidden one and represented the most powerful force in the universe, so publicly and violently defaced would have been a profoundly shocking and terrifying act, a direct assault on the cosmic order they had known since birth. Simultaneously, Akhenaten launched an economic stranglehold on the old religion. The vast temple estates of Amun, which for centuries had functioned as immense, self-sufficient corporations, were abruptly cut off from their lifeblood. The state subsidies of grain, gold, linen, and incense dried up. The flow of tribute from foreign lands was redirected to the coffers of the Aten in the new city of Akhetaten. The temple's extensive landholdings, which employed thousands of farmers, brewers, and bakers, were confiscated by the crown. This defunding had an immediate and devastating ripple effect. Without resources, the daily rituals that were believed to sustain the gods and, by extension, the universe itself, simply ceased. The bread and beer offerings stopped. The incense no longer clouded the sanctuaries. The hymns fell silent. The temples, once the bustling hearts of their communities, became hollow shells, their gates closed and their courtyards empty. This economic dismantling was perhaps even more effective than the physical destruction. A statue with a chiseled name was a powerful symbol, but a silent, dark temple was a tangible reality. It meant the god was no longer being fed, no longer being honored, and was therefore no longer present. The practical connection between the people and their divine protectors was severed at its source. The third and final domino to fall was the powerful priesthood itself. The clergy of Amun was not just a religious order, it was a political and economic dynasty, a class of immensely wealthy and influential men who had served as advisors to pharaohs for generations. Akhenaten dealt with this rival power base with ruthless efficiency. The priesthood was formally disbanded. The high priests lost their titles, their authority, and their luxurious livelihoods. Some may have been absorbed into the new, much smaller priesthood of the Aten in Akhetaten, but in roles that were likely ceremonial and subordinate to the royal family. Others were probably stripped of their positions and forced into obscurity. This dispersal of the priestly class shattered the institutional knowledge and oral traditions that had been passed down for over a millennium. The intricate rituals, the hidden meanings of texts, the precise astronomical calculations for festivals, all of this accumulated wisdom was scattered to the winds. The priests were the librarians of the gods, and by firing them and closing their libraries, Akhenaten ensured that even if someone wanted to restart the old cults, the expertise to do so correctly had been lost. This three-pronged attack, physical erasure, economic starvation, and institutional disbandment, was a comprehensive and chillingly effective strategy. It wasn't enough for Akhenaten to promote his new god. He had to ensure the old ones could never return, attempting to scrub them not just from stone, but from the very consciousness of an entire nation. But what did this monumental theological revolution actually feel like for the millions of ordinary Egyptians who weren't part of the royal inner circle living in the gleaming new capital? If you were a farmer tending your fields along the Nile, a potter in a small village, or a merchant navigating the delta, the rise of the Aten would have been a profoundly disorienting and isolating experience. A revolution that promised a direct connection to the divine, but in practice built a higher wall between the people and their gods than ever before. The core promise of Atenism was, on its surface, one of beautiful simplicity and universal access. The great hymn itself celebrated a god whose rays touched every creature and whose light enabled all work. This was a deity not hidden in a dark shrine, but visible to everyone every single day. In theory, this should have democratized faith, making the powerful, life-giving sun a god for every person in every home. Yet, the religious structure Akhenaten built around this idea had the opposite effect, creating a spiritual bottleneck of unprecedented scale. The entire system was meticulously designed to flow through one single point, the royal family. In the old religion, a complex and multi-layered network of intermediaries connected the people to the divine. You could pray to a household god like Bes for protection during childbirth. You could leave a small offering at a local shrine to Hathor for a favor in love. If you were wealthy enough, you could commission a prayer at a major temple, where a priest would deliver your petition to the god's statue. There was a pathway for everyone at every level of society. Under the Aten, all of these pathways were systematically demolished. The local shrines were closed or abandoned. The household idols were, in theory, rendered useless. The vast priesthood that had served as a spiritual bureaucracy was disbanded. In their place stood only Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters. The stunning art from Amarna makes this theology perfectly clear. In every relief, the rays of the Aten extend down from the sun disk, but they do not reach the people. They end in tiny hands that offer the Ankh, the symbol of life, exclusively to the nostrils of the king and queen. The common people, if they are depicted at all, are shown in the background, looking up at the royal family, their arms raised in praise, not to the Aten directly, but to the royal intermediaries who channeled its power. This meant that for an average person, practicing their faith became a passive, distant, and strangely impersonal activity. There were no more personal prayers addressed directly to a god who understood your specific troubles. Instead, your religious duty was to witness and support the royal family's direct relationship with the Aten. Your participation was to be a grateful beneficiary of the divine blessings that the Pharaoh, and only the Pharaoh, could draw down from heaven. Imagine the psychological shift. Your personal woes, your hopes for your family, your fears about the harvest, these were no longer the direct concern of a compassionate, approachable deity. Your spiritual well-being was now entirely dependent on the correct performance of rituals by a remote royal family in a city you would likely never see. This was a religion of spectacle and centralization, not of personal comfort or community. The comforting, chaotic, and deeply human world of 1,000 specialized gods was replaced by the silent, blinding, and abstract glare of a single sun, whose warmth you were told you could only feel reflected from your king. The practical consequences of this shift in daily life were immense and often deeply unsettling. Let's consider the cycle of festivals and community celebrations, which were the heartbeat of Egyptian social and religious life. Under the old gods, the year was marked by vibrant public processions. The statue of Amun would be carried from his dark sanctuary at Karnak on the shoulders of priests, journeying to a nearby temple while crowds lined the streets, cheering, dancing, and seeking oracles. These were events of immense joy and communal catharsis, moments where the divine felt tangibly present among the people. All of this vanished. The Aten had no statues to carry in procession. Its worship occurred in the open-air temples of Akhetaten, from which the general public was likely barred from the inner sanctums. There were no more public festivals for Osiris, no more drunken revelries for Hathor. The calendar, once a rich tapestry of holy days, became stark and monotonous, focused solely on rituals performed by and for the royal court. For the common people, the rhythm of life lost its familiar spiritual landmarks, leaving a void where community and celebration once thrived. Furthermore, the concept of the afterlife was thrown into terrifying ambiguity. For over 1,000 years, an Egyptian's greatest hope was a proper burial and a favorable judgment before Osiris, the merciful lord of the dead. This journey required amulets, spells from the Book of the Dead, and the support of gods like Anubis and Thoth. Akhenaten's revolution declared all of these gods obsolete. So what happened after you died? The official art and texts from Amarna are virtually silent on this matter. The beautiful, detailed depictions of the afterlife journey that adorned tomb walls for centuries were replaced by scenes of the royal family bathing in the Aten's rays in this life. The focus was overwhelmingly on earthly existence under the sun's beneficence. For the elite who built tombs at Amarna, their hope for eternity seems to have been a continued existence near the royal family, still enjoying the Aten's light. But for the average person, this offered little solace. The elaborate funerary industry that produced coffins, shabtis, and amulets ground to a halt, leaving people without the ritual tools that had guided their ancestors to salvation for generations. The comforting, well-mapped road to the afterlife became an uncharted wilderness, adding a layer of profound existential anxiety to the daily struggles of life. So, was this a religion for the people? The evidence points to a resounding no. While its central symbol was the most universal force in nature, its theological structure was the most exclusive in Egypt's history. It replaced a complex but accessible spiritual ecosystem with a stark, top-down monologue. It asked people to trade their personal, intimate relationships with a pantheon of relatable gods for a distant, abstract force that communicated with only one family. It exchanged vibrant community festivals for silent, remote observation. In its quest for purity and singular truth, Atenism stripped away the very things that made religion a source of personal comfort and communal strength for the average person. It was a breathtaking theological experiment imposed from above, one that looked magnificent in the open-air temples of Amarna, but left the rest of Egypt standing in the shadow of a revolution they never asked for, yearning for the return of the gods who had once known their names. While the sun-drenched courtyards of Akhetaten echoed with hymns to a single god, a very different kind of correspondence was flowing into the city's records office, letters etched on small, baked clay tablets, written not in Egyptian hieroglyphs but in the cuneiform script of international diplomacy. This collection, known today as the Amarna letters, provides a startling window into how Akhenaten's inward-focused revolution was perceived beyond Egypt's borders, revealing an empire beginning to fray at the edges as its pharaoh's gaze remained fixed on the heavens. For generations, Egypt's pharaohs had played the role of the Sun King, in a more traditional sense the unassailable superpower whose favor was sought by lesser rulers from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Vassal kings in the Levant sent groveling tributes and called the pharaoh their son, their father, and their god. Rival great kings like the rulers of Mitanni, Babylon, and Hatti addressed him as brother, engaged in elaborate gift exchanges, and cemented alliances through marriage. This delicate web of relationships required constant, active maintenance, military shows of force, timely responses to requests for aid, and the shrewd distribution of Egyptian gold to keep allies loyal. The Amarna letters show us that under Akhenaten, this meticulously managed system began to break down. The tone of the letters from Egypt's vassal states in Canaan and the Levant shifts dramatically from respectful petition to increasingly desperate pleading. Take the correspondence from Rib-Hadda, the ruler of the strategic city-state of Byblos. He wrote letter after letter to Akhenaten, describing in vivid detail how his city was under siege by rival forces and the growing threat of the Pharaoh, likely bands of outlaws or rebels. His messages become a heartbreaking chronicle of neglect. "Why does my lord not listen to my words?" he writes in one tablet. "All my villages that are in the mountains or by the sea have been taken. I am unable to go out of the gate of the city. If there are no troops within this year, all the lands will be joined to the Pharaoh." He begs for just a small contingent of Egyptian archers, a handful of troops, to demonstrate that the pharaoh still cares about his fate. Yet the evidence suggests these cries for help went largely unanswered. The Egyptian garrison troops, once the enforcers of pharaonic power in the region, seem to have been withdrawn or left unsupported. Local governors and vassal kings were left to fend for themselves, leading to a power vacuum that rival powers were all too eager to fill. This neglect wasn't just a matter of ignoring minor allies, it extended to Egypt's relationships with other great kingdoms. A letter from Tushratta, the king of Mitanni, a long-standing ally and the source of several Egyptian queens, expresses clear frustration. He had sent his daughter to marry Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, and the alliance was sealed with lavish gifts. Now Tushratta complains that the gold statues Akhenaten sent him as a gift are not solid gold, but merely gold-plated wood. In the nuanced language of Bronze Age diplomacy, this was a colossal insult, a sign of disrespect and a downgrading of their relationship. Similarly, the Babylonian king Kadashman in Lil-I writes with thinly veiled annoyance, questioning why Akhenaten has not sent the promised gold, and even implying that the Egyptian king treats his messengers with contempt. "In my brother's country all is well," he writes sarcastically, "but in my country all is not well. When I wrote to you about my personal affairs, you did not grant my request." These were not just petty squabbles over gifts, they were symptoms of a fundamental breakdown. Diplomacy in this era was a careful dance of reciprocity and honor. By failing to uphold his end of these exchanges, Akhenaten was signaling that Egypt was no longer a reliable partner, encouraging these powerful states to look elsewhere for alliances and perhaps even perceive Egypt as a weakening power ripe for challenge. The most significant consequence of this foreign policy neglect was the dramatic rise of the Hittite Empire under its ambitious king, Suppiluliuma I. While Akhenaten was absorbed in building his city and persecuting the cult of Amun, Suppiluliuma was embarking on a relentless military campaign. carving out a vast empire in Anatolia and, crucially, pushing south into the Levant, the very sphere of influence Egypt had controlled for centuries. The Amarna letters from vassals in Syria scream with panic as Hittite armies and their allies sweep through the region. The ruler of a state called Amun-Ra, a man named Azaru, plays a particularly telling role. He writes to Akhenaten proclaiming his loyalty, all the while secretly negotiating with the Hittites. When other vassals accuse him of treachery, Azaru's replies are full of excuses and delays. He is eventually summoned to Egypt to explain himself, but the pharaoh's response seems lethargic and ineffective. Azaru ultimately defects to the Hittites, taking his strategically vital territory with him. This event was a major geopolitical shift. Egypt lost a key buffer state, and the Hittites gained a foothold from which they could threaten the rest of Egypt's remaining holdings. Suppiluliuma, a king who ruled through military action and shrewd realpolitik, must have looked upon Akhenaten's theological obsessions with a mixture of bewilderment and opportunity. So why did the man who micromanaged the chiseling of God's names from temple walls fail to respond to the pleas of his own governors and the threats of rival empires? The answer seems to lie in the absolute, all-consuming nature of his religious project. Governing an empire requires pragmatism, compromise, and attention to 1,000 mundane details, dispatching troops, auditing tribute, and reading reports from the frontiers. Akhenaten's focus, however, was singular: the creation of Akhetaten, the establishment of a new priesthood, the composition of hymns, and the supervision of a radical new art style demanded his full intellectual and spiritual energy. Foreign kings and distant vassals were simply not his priority. The cosmic revolution he was engineering in his desert capital was, in his mind, infinitely more important than the squabbles of petty rulers in far-off lands. The traditional state machinery, with its experienced viziers and military commanders, may have been disrupted or sidelined, their expertise deemed irrelevant to the new divine order. The result was a dangerous paradox. At the very moment the pharaoh was proclaiming the Aten as the universal lord of all creation, his tangible earthly empire, the very proof of that God's favor, was beginning to crumble from inattention. The Amarna letters stand as a tragic counterpoint to the hymns of the Aten, a desperate, earthly chorus of alarm that went largely unheard by a king who was listening only to the light. As the sun began to set on Akhenaten's 17-year reign, a new and deeply enigmatic figure briefly stepped into the fading light, a ghost in the historical record whose identity has become one of Egyptology's most tantalizing puzzles. Just as the Amarna revolution seemed to be reaching its zenith, the royal artwork and scarce official records introduce a mysterious co-regent named Smenkhkare. For a fleeting moment, this individual appears alongside Akhenaten, depicted with all the regalia of a full pharaoh: the double crown, the crook and flail, and the royal cartouche. Yet, as quickly as Smenkhkare emerges from the shadows, they vanish, leaving behind a void of evidence and a cascade of questions that strike at the very heart of the regime's stability. Who was this sudden successor, and why does their appearance signal a period of growing crisis and confusion at the heart of the Aten's kingdom? The evidence for Smenkkare's existence is frustratingly scant and ambiguous. A handful of rings and wine jar dockets bear the name, and a few fragmented tomb scenes show a king named Smenkhkare alongside Akhenaten's eldest daughter, Meritaten, who is titled his great royal wife. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence comes from a tomb in Amarna itself, where a scene was altered. The original figures of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were recarved to show Akhenaten and Smenkhkare side by side, a clear indication of a sudden shift in the official royal narrative. The name Smenkhkare itself, meaning "vigorous is the soul of Ra," is telling. After years of names compounded with the Aten, the reappearance of Ra, the old solar deity, has been interpreted by many scholars as a potential early signal of a move away from the strict, exclusive worship of the Aten. perhaps an attempt to reconcile with the traditional religious forces that had been so violently suppressed. The debate over Smenkhkare's true identity has produced several compelling, competing theories, each with profound implications for our understanding of the eras in game. The most straightforward theory posits that Smenkhkare was a younger brother of Akhenaten, a hitherto unknown son of Amenhotep III, brought forward to serve as a junior co-regent to help manage a kingdom that was perhaps becoming increasingly difficult to control. This was a common practice in Egyptian history, ensuring a smooth transition of power and sharing the immense burden of rule. However, no definitive inscription has ever been found that confirms the existence of such a brother, leaving this theory resting on circumstantial evidence. A second, and for a long time very popular, theory suggests that Smenkhkare was in fact a young son of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, perhaps the ill-fated Tutankhaten who would later become the famous King Tut. Proponents of this idea argue that placing a young son on the throne as co-regent would secure the dynastic line and prepare him for ultimate power. The main problem with this theory is the timeline and the depiction of Smenkhkare. The figure shown in the art is not a child, but a fully grown adult depicted as an equal to Akhenaten. Furthermore, if Smenkhkare was Tutankhaten, it would mean he ruled briefly under one name before changing it back to Tutankhamun, which, while not impossible, adds another layer of complexity to an already convoluted succession. The most revolutionary and hotly debated theory, however, is that Smenkhkare was not a man at all but a woman, that the name was a new throne name adopted by none other than Queen Nefertiti herself. This argument, championed by a number of prominent Egyptologists, hinges on several fascinating pieces of evidence. First, Nefertiti disappears from the record at roughly the same time Smenkhkare appears. Her magnificent, unfinished tomb in Amarna was never used, suggesting she may not have died but instead transformed her identity. Second, the art of the period had already established a precedent for androgynous and fluid royal imagery. The body of Smenkhkare, as depicted in the few surviving reliefs, is slender and lacks overt masculine characteristics, not unlike the depictions of Akhenaten himself. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, some artifacts, including a small carved gem, show two royal cartouches next to each other, one for Ankh-Khepri Neferneferuaten, a name strongly associated with Nefertiti, and the other for Ankh-Khepri Smenkhkare. This has led to the compelling suggestion that these were two sequential names for the same person, first ruling as Neferneferuaten and then adopting the name Smenkhkare, possibly to signal a new political or theological direction. If this theory is correct, it means that in the final years, Nefertiti effectively became a female king, a co-pharaoh ruling alongside her husband, and then briefly alone, a testament to her immense and enduring power. Regardless of who was behind the crown, the very fact that a co-regent was necessary speaks volumes about the mounting pressures on the Amarna regime. The appearance of Smenkhkare points to a system under severe strain, both from within and without. After nearly 2 decades of Akhenaten's rule, the economic and political consequences of his revolution were likely becoming unsustainable. The empire was weakening, as the Amarna letters so vividly illustrate, with foreign territories slipping from Egyptian control. At home, the suppression of the traditional gods would have created a deep well of resentment and anxiety among the population and the powerful noble families who had been sidelined. The state's finances, once enriched by the revenues of the Amun temples, were now funneled into the maintenance of a single, remote capital and its cult. Appointing a co-regent could have been a strategic move to share this administrative burden, to project an image of renewed strength and stability, or to prepare for an inevitable succession in a court that may have been growing increasingly restless and fearful about the future. The co-regency, however, was tragically short-lived. Within a year or two, both Akhenaten and Smenkhkare disappear from history. The circumstances of their deaths are entirely unknown, lost to the systematic destruction of records that would follow. Their passing left a power vacuum of catastrophic proportions. The throne did not pass to a seasoned adult but to a child, the boy now known to the world as Tutankhamun. This sudden shift to a juvenile king, guided by the old guard of military and court officials, signals a complete collapse of Akhenaten's direct line and his revolutionary vision. The brief, ghostly reign of Smenkhkare therefore stands as the final, faltering heartbeat of the Amarna experiment. It was a desperate attempt to stabilize a regime that had alienated its people, neglected its empire, and challenged the cosmic order itself, an attempt that ultimately failed, leaving a 9-year-old boy to inherit the shattered pieces of a kingdom that had been remade and was now on the verge of being unmade once again. And so, onto this fractured stage, a boy walked. He was likely no more than 8 or 9 years old when the weight of the double crown was placed upon his head, a child tasked with cleaning up the wreckage of a theological dream. His given name was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, a name chosen by his parents, quite possibly Akhenaten and a minor wife named Kia, as a perfect emblem of their devotion to the sun disk. He was a product of the Amarna revolution, born and raised in the stark, sun-drenched city of Akhetaten, surrounded by the strange, flowing art and the singular hymns to his father's god. His entire world, from the architecture of his home to the very syllables of his name, was a testament to the Aten's supremacy. Yet this child, who had known no other reality, would become the instrument through which that reality was systematically dismantled. His name forever changed to the one we know today, Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The inheritance this boy pharaoh received was less a kingdom and more a crisis. Imagine the scene he was thrust into. The royal court had been uprooted from the traditional power centers and was now residing in the remote and, by all accounts, increasingly isolated capital of Akhetaten. But with Akhenaten and his immediate successor gone, the city of the sun disk must have felt like a gilded ghost town, its grand palaces and open-air temples standing as monuments to a fading vision. The economic toll of Akhenaten's project was immense. For nearly 2 decades, the state's vast resources had been funneled into building and maintaining this single city and its cult, while the traditional temple economies across Egypt had been deliberately starved. The administrative machinery of the state, once managed by a complex bureaucracy tied to the old gods, was in disarray, and perhaps most dangerously, the powerful military and political factions that had been sidelined by Akhenaten's revolution were now, with a child on the throne, positioned to reassert their influence with a vengeance. The religious landscape the young king inherited was nothing short of chaotic. On one hand, the official state religion was still the cult of the Aten. The temples in Akhetaten still stood, and the doctrine of a single, universal sun god was in theory the law of the land. But in practice, the faith had likely failed to take deep root among the general populace. For the average Egyptian, the comforting, familiar presence of Amun, Osiris, Isis, and the entire host of traditional deities had not been erased from their hearts, only from their temples. The spiritual void created by Akhenaten's top-down revolution would have been filled with longing, resentment, and a deep-seated anxiety that the cosmos was out of balance. The silence in the dark sanctuaries of Karnak was a deafening cry for the return of the gods. The powerful priesthood of Amun, though officially disbanded, still existed as a social and intellectual class, waiting in the wings for an opportunity to restore their gods, their power, and their understanding of Maat, the fundamental order of the universe. It is crucial to understand that Tutankhaten did not make these earth-shattering decisions alone. He was a child, and behind the throne stood a regency council of older, experienced officials who effectively ruled on his behalf. The key figures in this shadow government were 2 men who represented the very pillars of the old order that Akhenaten had tried to topple. The first was I, a seasoned courtier who held the title God's father. I was likely the brother of Akhenaten's mother, Queen Ti, making him the young pharaoh's great-uncle. He was a political survivor who had managed to navigate the treacherous waters of the Amarna court, and his presence suggests a direct link back to the royal lineage of Amenhotep III. The second and perhaps more powerful figure was Horemheb, the commander-in-chief of the army. Horemheb embodied the military establishment that had seen Egypt's influence abroad wither while the pharaoh was preoccupied with his religious reforms. For the army, a strong Egypt required a strong pharaoh who projected power externally, not one who retreated into the desert. Together, Ai and Horemheb represented a coalition of administrative and military force that was poised to steer the boy king toward a dramatic course correction. Their goal was not to patch up the existing system, but to execute a full-scale counter-revolution, using the young Tutankhaten as their legitimizing figurehead. This sets the stage for one of the most profound about-faces in history. The boy who was named as a living monument to the Aten was about to become the vehicle for its official repudiation. The decisions made in the early years of his reign were not merely administrative tweaks. They were a deliberate and comprehensive program of restoration, aimed at healing the spiritual and political fractures that had torn the country apart. The world watched as a child, guided by the hands of the old god, prepared to lead his people out of the brilliant, blinding light of his father's sun and back into the comforting, familiar shadows of 1,000 gods. Within just a few years of his reign, the boy king's government made a proclamation that would echo through the halls of eternity, formally dismantling his father's entire theological project. This official decree, known today as the Restoration Stela, was erected in the great temple of Karnak, and its words were not merely a policy shift. They were a profound apology to the gods and a desperate plea for forgiveness from a civilization that believed its very survival was at stake. The stela's text, issued in the name of the young Tutankhamun but undoubtedly penned by his regents Ai and Horemheb, paints a picture of a nation in spiritual and political ruin. It describes a time when the temples and the cities of the gods and goddesses had fallen into neglect, their shrines in disrepair and their ceremonies forgotten. It laments that if you prayed to a god, he did not come at all, and if you pleaded with a goddess, she did not come at all. The land was sick, the text implies, because the gods had turned their backs, and the only cure was a complete and utter return to the old ways. This was the official death certificate for the Amarna revolution, a public admission that Akhenaten's grand experiment had alienated the divine and brought the kingdom to the brink of collapse. The first and most symbolic act of this great reversal was the king's own reinvention through the power of his name. The boy who had been christened Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, was officially rebranded as Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. In the worldview of ancient Egypt, this was not a simple administrative update. It was a magical act of profound significance. A name was a core component of the soul, and by excising Aten and inserting Amun, the court was performing a spiritual exorcism. They were purging the young king's very identity of the heretical taint and reconsecrating him as the rightful son of the traditional king of the gods. This personal name change was a signal to every priest, noble, and official in the land. The old order was not just returning, it was reclaiming the monarchy itself, starting with the pharaoh's own soul. It was a declaration that the legitimacy of the throne would once again be measured by its devotion to Amun, not its defiance of him. With the theological direction set, the Restoration Stela outlined a sweeping program of practical and economic revival aimed at resuscitating the traditional religious infrastructure. The state treasury, which for 2 decades had been funneled almost exclusively into the cult of the Aten and the maintenance of the remote capital at Akhetaten, was now thrown open to the old gods. The decree boasts of making new the sanctuaries that had fallen into ruin and fashioning all their images in gold. This was a massive, nationwide public works project. Work crews were dispatched to temples from the Delta to Nubia, tasked with repairing crumbling walls, recarving defaced inscriptions, and cleaning out the debris that had accumulated in once sacred courtyards. More importantly, the state reinstated the vast endowments of land, livestock, and precious materials that had been the lifeblood of the temples. The daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense were restored, a practical act that was believed to literally feed the gods and invite them back into their homes. The economic engine of Egypt was forcibly shifted away from the singular, failing project at Amarna and back toward the diverse, decentralized network of temples that had sustained the country's spiritual and economic health for a millennium. The human element of this restoration was just as critical as the stone and gold. The priesthood of Amun, which had been officially disbanded and stripped of its power, was formally reconstituted. The old high priests and their scribes, who had likely been living in a sort of internal exile, were summoned back to service. A new generation of priests was recruited and trained, tasked with relearning the intricate rituals and hymns that had been suppressed for a generation. This was no small feat. Akhenaten's systematic campaign had not only closed the temples but had also disrupted the oral and written transmission of sacred knowledge. The returning priests had to piece together the correct ceremonies from fragmentary records and fading memories, a process that must have been fraught with anxiety, as a single misplaced word in a ritual was believed to render it ineffective. The restoration of the priesthood was the key that unlocked the temple doors. It meant the statues could be dressed, the hymns could be chanted, and the festivals could be celebrated once more, re-establishing the crucial dialogue between the people and the pantheon of gods they had so desperately missed. Perhaps the most powerful gesture of all was the physical abandonment of Akhetaten, the city built for a single god. The royal court packed up its administration, its archives, and its royal household and made the journey south, back to the traditional religious capital of Thebes. The horizon of the Aten was left to the desert winds, its grand palaces and open-air temples beginning a slow decay into the ghost town we know today as Amarna. Returning to Thebes was a symbolic homecoming of immense proportions. Thebes was the city of Amun, its skyline dominated by the colossal pillars of Karnak. By re-establishing the court there, Tutankhamun's government was visually and politically reaffirming that the state's power was once again inseparable from the cult of its chief deity. Thebes was not just a city of buildings, it was a city of processions, of festivals, of noise and color and life. The return of the Opet festival, where the statue of Amun was carried in a grand bark from Karnak to Luxor amid cheering crowds, would have been a visceral, emotional experience for a populace that had endured nearly 2 decades of silent, remote worship. It was a public declaration that the gods were back and that the pharaoh was once again their chief servant, celebrating their presence among the people. The reign of Tutankhamun, therefore, stands as one of history's most decisive counter-reformations. It was not a time of innovation but of conscious, deliberate revival. The boy king, guided by the shrewd political survivors of his father's court, served as the perfect vessel for this restoration. His youth and his direct lineage from the heretic Pharaoh himself lent an air of legitimacy to the reversal that no other ruler could have provided. It was as if the revolution had consumed itself. The son of the man who had tried to erase Amun became the god's greatest champion, his very name a repudiation of his own father's life's work. Tutankhamun's legacy, often overshadowed by the golden treasures of his tomb, is fundamentally this: he was the restorer of cosmic order. He presided over the careful, systematic stitching back together of a religious fabric that had been violently torn, ensuring that the names of Amun, Osiris, Ptah, and Hathor would once again be spoken in the temples and homes of Egypt, their stories and their power flowing once more like the Nile itself, life-giving and eternal. But the counter-revolution did not stop with simply restoring the old gods. The powers that now guided Egypt, the general Hormheb and the courtier Ai, who would both become pharaoh after Tutankhamun's untimely death, understood that to truly secure the return of the old order, they had to do more than just rebuild temples. They had to annihilate the memory of the man who had challenged that order in the first place. they embarked on a systematic, state-sanctioned campaign to scrape Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their entire aberrant era from the face of history, a practice the Romans would later call damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This was not random vandalism. It was a cold, calculated, and eerily thorough program of historical cleansing designed to convince future generations that the Amarna period had never happened at all. The most visible and visceral evidence of this campaign is found in the shattered stone of the monuments themselves. Following the abandonment of Amarna, royal work crews were dispatched with chisels and hammers, their instructions chillingly precise. They were to locate every cartouche, the oval ring that enclosed a royal name containing the names Akhenaten, Nefertiti, or their immediate successors, and methodically hack them out. You can see this destruction today. On the boundary stele marking the limits of the abandoned city of Akhetaten, the figure of Akhenaten often remains, but his face and his name have been obliterated, leaving a rough, scarred patch in the stone. In the tombs of the nobles who had served him at Amarna, scenes of the royal family were defaced with a particular fury. The Aten sun disk was often left intact, but the hands at the end of its rays, which reached down to touch the king and queen, were carefully chiseled away, symbolically severing the divine connection that was the core of their legitimacy. This was a targeted destruction, meant to neutralize the magical and political power of their names and images without necessarily destroying the entire monument, a clear sign that the effort was about erasing specific individuals, not about mindless rage. This erasure extended beyond the ruins of Amarna to the very heart of the traditional Egyptian state. At Karnak, where Akhenaten had first built his temples to the Aten, the stone blocks from those structures were systematically dismantled. But they weren't discarded or burned. Instead, they were used as filler material, as rubble for the foundations and cores of new constructions by later pharaohs like Horemheb. Imagine the symbolism. The sacred stones inscribed with the hymns to the Aten and the images of the heretic king were literally buried, hidden from the sun's rays forever, crushed under the weight of the reconstructed temples to Amun. This was a profound physical metaphor for the triumph of the old gods over the new. The revolution was not just rejected, it was entombed, its physical remains used as the unseeing, unfeeling foundation for the restored glory of the traditional pantheon. The final and most definitive step in this process of historical annihilation was the excision of the Amarna pharaohs from the official king lists. These lists, inscribed on temple walls, were the formal, divinely sanctioned record of the rulers of Egypt. They were not simple historical documents, they were part of the sacred order, proving the unbroken lineage of power passed from the gods to each successive pharaoh. In these lists, the succession moves directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the 17-year reign of Akhenaten and the brief rules of Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and I were a chaotic, illegitimate interlude that never occurred. This was the ultimate denial. By removing them from the official lineage, the state declared that Akhenaten's reign was not merely a mistake or a heresy. It was a non-event, a tear in the sacred fabric of time that was now being mended by pretending it had never been torn at all. To be forgotten in ancient Egypt was the worst possible fate, a second death more final than the first, and this is precisely what the architects of the Restoration sought to impose upon the heretic and his family. The motivation for this comprehensive memory condemnation was multifaceted, driven by a potent mix of political pragmatism, religious fervor, and raw fear. Politically, Horemheb and his successors needed to legitimize their own rule. Horemheb, a commoner and a military man, had no direct royal bloodline. His claim to the throne was based on his role as the restorer of order. By painting the Amarna period as a time of chaos and divine abandonment, and by presenting himself as the one who ended that chaos, he bolstered his own legitimacy. Erasing his immediate predecessors, including the boy King Tutankhamun and the elderly I, helped shorten the line of succession, making his own ascent seem more direct and preordained. It was a way of writing his rivals out of the story so that he could become the heroic savior in the final chapter. But the reasons went far deeper than simple political calculation. On a theological level, Akhenaten's revolution was seen as a catastrophic rupture in the cosmic balance of Maat. His actions were believed to have brought disease, foreign invasion, and economic decline upon Egypt because he had offended the true gods. His very existence was a pollution, a dangerous memory that, if allowed to persist, could once again summon divine displeasure. To speak the name of the dead was to keep them alive in the afterlife, and the state could not risk allowing a spiritual terrorist like Akhenaten to retain any form of existence, even in memory. His name and image were not just historical facts, they were active, dangerous forces that had to be neutralized. The systematic destruction was a form of national exorcism, a ritual cleansing of the landscape to ensure the gods would once again look favorably upon the two lands. The chisel blows that shattered Akhenaten's face were, in their own way, as much a religious act as the offering of incense to Amun. Both were essential to restoring a universe that had been pushed to the brink of collapse. The efforts of Tutankhamun and his regents to restore the old gods were monumental, but the damage wrought by Akhenaten's revolution ran deep, leaving a kingdom in need of more than just theological repair. Imagine the sheer economic drain of the Amarna period. Building an entirely new capital city from scratch in a barren stretch of desert was a project of staggering extravagance. For over a decade, the state's resources, the labor of thousands of skilled artisans and common workers, immense quantities of stone, vast stores of food to feed the workforce, and priceless cargoes of gold, ivory, and lapis lazuli for decoration were poured into the creation and maintenance of Akhetaten. To then abandon that city after less than 2 decades and redirect all those same resources back to rebuilding the neglected temples of Thebes, Memphis, and beyond was a catastrophic financial double blow. It was like a nation building a second, duplicate set of national infrastructure capitals, temples, palaces only to declare the first set obsolete and start over, all within a single generation. The treasury, once overflowing with the gold of a mighty empire under Amenhotep III, was likely stretched to its absolute limits, drained by a pharaoh's dream and his successor's necessary, yet ruinously expensive counter-dream. This economic whiplash was accompanied by a profound social and psychological disruption for the Egyptian people. For nearly 20 years, an entire generation had been told that the gods their parents and grandparents had worshipped were not just false but actively evil, their names worthy of being chiseled from stone. Now they were told the exact opposite, that the old gods were the only true powers and that their recent devotion to the Aten had been a terrible, nation-cursing mistake. This was not a gentle shift in policy. It was a spiritual whiplash that must have created deep confusion and anxiety. Consider the average priest who had served Amun, who was stripped of his position and livelihood, forced to watch as his life's work was defaced. Or the artisan who had spent years mastering the strange, flowing lines of Amarna art, only to be ordered to return to the rigid, formal styles of his grandfather's time. For the common farmer, the return of the old festivals would have been a welcome relief, but it also came with a lingering unease. If the state's understanding of the divine could be so completely overturned once, what was to stop it from happening again? The absolute certainty that had underpinned Egyptian society for a millennium had been shattered, replaced by a precarious sense that the cosmic order was not as eternal and unshakable as they had always believed. The monumental task of truly stabilizing the kingdom and erasing this uncertainty fell to the pharaohs who followed Tutankhamun, men who were determined to project an image of unbreakable traditional power. The first was Ai, the elderly courtier who had been part of the Restoration government. His reign was brief, a mere 4 years, and served as a bridge. But it was his successor, the General Horemheb, who launched the most aggressive campaign to solidify the counter-revolution. Horemheb was the ultimate political survivor. He had managed to serve under Akhenaten without his name being tainted, likely by focusing on his military duties, and then positioned himself as the restorer of order. As pharaoh, he did not just continue the restoration, he institutionalized it and codified it into law. He issued a sweeping legal decree known as the Great Edict, which was aimed squarely at rooting out the corruption and administrative chaos that had flourished during the Amarna period. The edict prescribed harsh punishments, from nose-cutting and exile to impalement for corrupt officials, soldiers who stole from civilians, and tax collectors who abused their power. This was a clear message: the era of lax, idiosyncratic rule was over. The state bureaucracy, which had been warped to serve a single man's religious vision, was being forcibly returned to its core function: efficient, predictable, and traditional governance. Horemheb's most enduring act, however, was to ensure a stable succession, something the Amarna period had catastrophically failed to do. With no son of his own, he appointed his own vizier, a fellow military man named Parames, as his successor. This man would become Ramesses I, the founder of the mighty 19th dynasty, the Ramesside kings who would spend the next century trying to outbuild and outpraise the old gods in an effort to bury the Amarna heresy for good. The Ramessides understood that memory is built in stone, and they embarked on the most ambitious temple-building program since the Pyramid Age. Seti I and his son, Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, covered the land in monumental architecture. At Karnak, they constructed the Great Hypostyle Hall, a breathtaking forest of 134 massive columns that utterly dwarfed any structure Akhenaten had ever built. The sheer scale was a deliberate statement. The House of Amun was back, and it was more powerful and glorious than ever before. They built entire rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia, their colossal statues staring out across the desert as eternal sentinels of traditional power. Every inch of these new monuments was covered in deeply traditional reliefs showing the pharaoh smiting foreign enemies, making offerings to a pantheon of gods, and being blessed by Amun-Ra and Ptah. The art was a conscious rejection of Amarna's fluid, naturalistic style, a return to the rigid, perfect, and muscular ideals of kingship that screamed stability, permanence, and a return to the one true path. Yet, for all their efforts to project an image of seamless continuity, the ghost of Amarna lingered. You can see its subtle influence if you look closely. The poetic language of the great hymn to the Aten, with its beautiful, direct descriptions of the natural world, seems to have left a mark on later religious texts, which occasionally adopt a more personal and accessible tone when addressing the gods. More tangibly, the political lesson of Amarna was not lost on the Ramessides. They took great pains to avoid creating another rival power base like the priesthood of Amun that had so threatened Akhenaten's father. They elevated the cults of other gods like Ptah of Memphis and the state god Set, and they tightly intertwined the military with the priesthood, ensuring that the two most powerful institutions in the land were loyal to the crown. The Ramesside pharaohs were often shown leading their armies in person, a stark contrast to Akhenaten's isolated, domestic portrayals. They were warrior kings, actively expanding the empire and defending its borders, proving through action that the pharaoh's primary role was as an earthly leader and protector, not just a theological innovator. In their relentless building, their military campaigns, and their very public devotion to a broad pantheon, the Ramessides were performing a national therapy session, using stone and soldier to reassure a traumatized civilization that the gods were indeed appeased. The king was firmly in charge, and the bizarre, unsettling interlude of the heretic pharaoh was finally, completely, and forever over. So where does this leave us in our judgment of Akhenaten himself, this most baffling of pharaohs? Was he a divinely inspired prophet, a revolutionary genius who saw a transcendent truth 1,000 years ahead of his time? Or was he a dangerous fanatic, an egomaniacal tyrant whose personal obsession shattered the stability of a mighty empire? This is the core debate that has raged among Egyptologists and historians for over a century, a debate that forces us to grapple with the very definition of visionary leadership. Let's first consider the case for Akhenaten as a spiritual pioneer. In this view, he stands as one of history's first great religious innovators. The theology expressed in his great hymn to the Aten is breathtakingly sophisticated. It moves beyond the limited, nationalistic gods of Egypt to proclaim a single, universal creator whose power sustains every corner of the natural world, from the birds in the sky to the fish in the river. Proponents of this view, like the famed archaeologist James Henry Breasted, hailed Akhenaten as the first individual in human history, a thinker whose poetic vision of a loving, life-giving deity bears a startling and profound resemblance to later monotheistic concepts found in the Hebrew Psalms. From this perspective, his revolution wasn't an act of madness, but a courageous attempt to sweep away a corrupt and bloated priesthood, replacing a complex system of superstition and ritual with a purer, more direct form of worship centered on the tangible, life-sustaining power of the sun. His art, with its intimate family scenes, can be seen as an attempt to humanize the monarchy and connect divine blessing to the universal experience of love and family. In this light, Akhenaten was a tragic figure, a man whose vision was simply too radical, too advanced for the world he was born into, a brilliant light extinguished by the forces of ingrained tradition. Yet there is an equally compelling and much darker interpretation. The other side of the coin paints Akhenaten not as a visionary, but as a despotic heretic whose reign was an unmitigated disaster. In this view, his actions were not those of an enlightened reformer, but of an absolute monarch drunk on his own power. His enlightened monotheism was, in practice, brutally enforced from the top down. He didn't gently persuade his people of a new truth. He commanded it, sending out work gangs to violently erase the names of gods that millions had loved and trusted for generations. His revolution was not one of liberation but of extreme centralization. By declaring that only he and his family could directly interact with the Aten, he didn't bring people closer to God. He erected an impenetrable wall between the divine and the populace, making himself the sole, indispensable conduit for all spiritual grace. This looks less like spiritual enlightenment and more like the ultimate consolidation of political and religious power in one man's hands. His neglect of foreign policy and the military, so vividly documented in the Amarna letters, reveals a ruler utterly detached from the practical responsibilities of governing a vast empire. While he composed beautiful hymns in his remote desert capital, Egyptian influence crumbled, vassal states fell to the Hittites, and the empire his ancestors built was brought to the brink of ruin. From this angle, Akhenaten was not a genius but an irresponsible egomaniac, a fanatic who was willing to sacrifice the security and spiritual comfort of an entire civilization on the altar of his own personal revelation. Perhaps the most revealing way to understand Akhenaten is to move beyond the simple binary of visionary or heretic and consider a third, more psychological possibility, that he was the ultimate product of his own upbringing. He was raised in the absolute pinnacle of pharaonic power, a golden age where his father, Amenhotep III, was literally worshipped as a living god. What happens when a person is raised from birth to believe they are the infallible center of the universe, and then inherits that power in its most absolute form? Akhenaten may have taken the concept of divine kingship to its logical and terrifying conclusion. If the Pharaoh was a god on earth, then surely his understanding of the divine was supreme. If he experienced a personal revelation of a single god, then it must be true for everyone, everywhere, and all competing truths must be annihilated. His unique physical portrayal in art, so different from the traditional athletic ideal, suggests a man who was deeply self-conscious about his own body, perhaps due to a genetic condition. This personal sense of being different could have fueled a desire to redefine the very image of divinity in his own unique likeness, creating a god whose sole representative on earth was a king who himself defied conventional appearance. In this psychological reading, the Amarna revolution becomes a vast project of cosmic narcissism, the ultimate act of a man who believed so completely in his own divine nature that he felt empowered to remake heaven and earth in his own image, regardless of the human cost. His story is a timeless and chilling cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, fused with an unshakable conviction of one's own righteousness, a combination that can create both breathtaking beauty and catastrophic ruin. One of the most enduring and controversial puzzles surrounding the heretic Pharaoh doesn't come from a crumbling stela or a looted tomb, but from the strange and beautiful art he left behind. For centuries, pharaohs were depicted as paragons of idealized strength, muscular, broad-shouldered, and eternally youthful. Yet Akhenaten chose to be portrayed with a startlingly different physique. An elongated, almost misshapen skull, a gaunt face with heavy-lidded eyes, a slender neck, narrow shoulders, a soft, rounded belly, wide hips, and spindly legs. This dramatic departure from 1,000 years of artistic tradition is so pronounced that it has led many to ask a provocative medical question. Was Akhenaten's radical revolution not just a matter of theology, but also a manifestation of his own unique biology? Could the pharaoh who tried to remake the gods have been living with a rare physical condition that shaped his entire worldview? One of the earliest and most debated theories posits that Akhenaten suffered from Froelic's syndrome, a rare endocrine disorder. The characteristics seem, at first glance, to match the Amarna art perfectly. Froelic's syndrome, which typically manifests in adolescence, can cause delayed puberty, obesity concentrated around the hips and chest, and underdeveloped genitalia, leading to infertility. The theory suggests that the pharaoh's androgynous figure, with its wide hips and lack of muscular definition, could be a realistic depiction of this condition. Proponents argue that such a diagnosis might explain more than just his appearance. A man living with this condition would have been set apart from the traditional image of the virile, warrior pharaoh, potentially fueling a deep-seated sense of alienation from the established order. This personal otherness could have driven him to reject the conventional standards of beauty and power, both in art and in religion, creating a new divine ideal that mirrored his own unique form. Furthermore, if the condition affected his fertility, it could add a layer of tragedy to his reign. Despite being depicted with 6 daughters, the lack of a clear male heir may have contributed to the ultimate collapse of his dynasty, as the throne passed to the boy Tutankhamun, whose parentage remains uncertain. However, the Froelich syndrome theory is riddled with significant problems that have led most modern scholars to dismiss it. The most glaring issue is that the art also consistently shows Akhenaten as an active and dynamic figure. He is depicted driving chariots, smiting enemies in a traditional pose, and energetically participating in rituals. Froelich syndrome is typically associated with weakness, fatigue, and a lack of physical vigor, which contradicts this energetic portrayal. More conclusively, the man we see in the statues was clearly not infertile. Historical records and art confirm he fathered at least 6 children with his great royal wife Nefertiti. The theory also relies heavily on the assumption that Amarna art was purely photorealistic, a notion that is increasingly challenged by the idea that the style was a deliberate and exaggerated theological statement. A more compelling, though still contested, modern hypothesis points toward Marfan syndrome. This genetic disorder of the connective tissue often results in a very specific set of physical traits: tall stature with an elongated face, a high-arched palate, a slender, lanky build with long fingers, a sunken chest, and eye problems. Many of these features align remarkably well with Akhenaten's depictions: the elongated head and face, the slender neck, the wide hips suggesting loose joints, and the spindly limbs. Marfan sufferers are often unusually tall, which would have made the pharaoh a literal giant among his people, a visually powerful symbol of being set apart. Unlike Froelic's, Marfan syndrome does not typically affect cognitive function or fertility, allowing for the dynamic, prolific life the historical record implies. If Akhenaten did have Marfan, his physical reality would have been a daily, visible testament to his difference. In a culture that prized symmetry and perfection as reflections of divine order, his own body would have been a walking challenge to the status quo. This constant physical otherness could have been a powerful psychological catalyst, convincing him that he was uniquely chosen for a purpose that lay outside the old, rigid definitions of kingship and divinity. Yet, we must be cautious about reducing a complex historical revolution to a simple diagnosis. The primary evidence is still art, not a mummy. While Akhenaten's tomb was discovered, his remains have never been conclusively identified, leaving us without the definitive proof a modern genetic or medical analysis could provide. This absence forces us to confront a critical question. Are we looking at a medical record, or are we looking at a sophisticated artistic and religious manifesto? Many Egyptologists argue powerfully for the latter. The exaggerated features of the entire royal family in Amarna art, including Nefertiti and their daughters, suggest that this was a conscious style and ideology carved in stone. The elongated forms and fluid bodies may have been intended to symbolize the fertile, life-giving energy of the Aten, a deliberate break from the static, eternal perfection of traditional art to represent a universe in constant, dynamic flux. The androgyny of the king's image might not reflect a hormonal condition, but a theological concept that the creator Aten, and by extension its chief intermediary, contained and unified both male and female creative principles within a single being. So, where does this leave the tantalizing link between body and belief? It is perhaps most fruitful to see these two ideas not as competing explanations, but as forces that may have intertwined in the pharaoh's mind. Imagine a king who, for whatever reason, be it Marfan syndrome or another genetic trait, looked fundamentally different from his predecessors. This physical distinctiveness would have been impossible to ignore in a society where the pharaoh's body was a sacred text. It could have fostered a deep-seated conviction that he was not meant to follow the old path. His personal sense of being chosen or different could have found its ultimate expression in a revolutionary religious idea. A god who was also radically different, a formless, universal sun disk that rejected the animal-headed, statue-bound pantheon of old. His body, then, may not have caused his religion, but it could have provided the powerful personal justification for it. It allowed him to embody his own revolution, to become the living proof that the old ideals were obsolete. In the end, the medical mystery of Akhenaten remains unsolved, but it opens a fascinating window into the profound connection between a leader's physical self-perception and their capacity to reshape the world. It suggests that history's most dramatic upheavals can sometimes spring from the most intimate and personal of sources. This stunningly modern vision of a single, universal creator god raises one of the most tantalizing questions in the history of religion. Did the spark of Atenism, seemingly extinguished in the sands of Egypt, somehow travel across the centuries to ignite the great monotheistic traditions that would follow, particularly Judaism? The parallels, especially between the great hymn to the Aten and later biblical psalms, are so striking that they have fueled a century of scholarly debate, a fascinating detective story that stretches from the abandoned ruins of Amarna to the hills of ancient Canaan. When you place the Aten hymn side by side with Psalm 104, the resemblance is almost unnerving. Both texts move through the cycle of day and night, observing how the divine presence governs the behavior of animals and the daily labor of humanity. The Aten hymn declares, "All flocks leap on their feet, all that fly and alight live when you rise for them." Centuries later, the psalmist would write, "The young lions roar for their prey. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to his labor until the evening. This shared structure, a celebration of a creator God's providence as revealed in the natural world, is too specific to be easily dismissed as mere coincidence. It suggests a possible thread of theological influence, a revolutionary idea that refused to die with the Pharaoh who invented it. The most compelling historical scenario for how this idea could have traveled involves the well-documented movements of people in the late Bronze Age. We know from the Amarna letters that Egypt maintained a firm, though increasingly neglected, political and military presence in Canaan, the very region where the early Israelite culture would later emerge. After the collapse of Akhenaten's regime and the return to orthodoxy, what happened to the priests, scribes, and court officials who had devoted their lives to the Aten cult? They would have been persona non grata in the newly restored Egypt of Horemheb and the Ramessides. It is entirely plausible that some of these displaced elites, carrying their radical theological ideas with them, fled east into Canaan. There they could have found refuge among the semi-nomadic groups known as the Haparu, who some scholars link to the early Hebrews. A small group of educated, literate refugees possessing a sophisticated concept of a single, universal God. Joining with a pastoral tribe, this is the exact kind of cultural fusion that could have planted the seed of an exclusive monotheism that would, over centuries, evolve into the Yahweh worship of ancient Israel. This refugee theory provides a plausible human channel for the transmission of a revolutionary idea from a dying Egyptian cult to a nascent Near Eastern religion. Furthermore, we can look at the timing. The Amarna period unfolded in the 14th century before the Common Era. The earliest evidence for a distinct Israelite identity, such as the Merneptah stele which mentions Israel as a people in Canaan, appears in the late 13th century. This leaves a gap of roughly 100 years, a plausible time frame for theological concepts to be absorbed, adapted, and transformed within a new cultural context. The early Hebrew god, Yahweh, as depicted in the oldest parts of the Bible, shares some intriguing characteristics with the Aten. Both are portrayed as creator gods who are not easily represented by physical idols. Both are deeply associated with the power of nature, though Yahweh's domain expands to encompass storms and mountains as well as the sun. Most importantly, the core theological leap, from a pantheon of specialized gods to a single, supreme deity who demands exclusive worship, is the same monumental shift that Akhenaten attempted to enforce. The Hebrew prophets, like Isaiah, would later rail against idolatry with a fervor that echoes Akhenaten's chiseling cruise, commanding the worship of a God who declared, "I am the Lord and there is no other." However, we must temper this fascinating speculation with a heavy dose of scholarly caution. The differences between Atenism and early Judaism are just as profound as the similarities, and they cannot be ignored. Akhenaten's monotheism was fundamentally a monotheism of the Pharaoh. The average person could not access the Aten directly. They had to worship through the divine king who served as the sole intermediary. In stark contrast, the covenant established between Yahweh and the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible was with the entire people. "You shall be my people, and I will be your God," is a collective agreement, one that, while mediated by prophets and priests, was made with the community as a whole. This represents a radical democratization of the divine relationship that is completely absent from the top-down, authoritarian structure of Atenism. Additionally, the Aten was a nature god, a personification of the sun's physical power. Yahweh, especially as he evolved in later prophetic tradition, became increasingly transcendent and abstract, a god of history and moral law whose essence was beyond the natural world he had created. The ethical dimension of Judaism, its profound concern for social justice, care for the widow and the orphan, and its intricate legal codes finds no parallel in the scant records of Atenism, which seems more focused on cosmic creation and royal legitimacy than on a moral law for all humanity. So, where does this leave us? Did Atenism directly father Judaism? The evidence is too thin to support such a bold, linear claim. A more nuanced and widely accepted view is that Akhenaten's revolution should be seen not as a direct ancestor, but as a powerful precursor. He was the first person in recorded history to articulate, in a sustained and sophisticated way, the concept of a single, universal creator god. He proved that such a radical idea could be conceived and, for a brief moment, implemented within a complex polytheistic society. The memory of this astonishing religious experiment, carried by refugees and traders along the well-worn routes between Egypt and Canaan, may have lingered in the cultural air of the Levant. It became part of the swirling mix of religious ideas that the early Israelites encountered and from which they forged their own unique identity. In this sense, Akhenaten's true legacy may not be a specific theological doctrine that was copied, but the demonstration of a revolutionary possibility. He showed that it was conceivable to sweep away the many and focus on the one. The Hebrews, drawing on their own experiences and revelations, would take that foundational concept and build upon it an enduring, ethical, and deeply personal monotheism that would forever change the world. The heretic Pharaoh's dream of a single sun god died in the desert, but the echo of his radical question, "What if there is only one?" refused to be silenced, resonating through the centuries until it found a new and lasting voice. For nearly 3,000 years, the memory of Akhenaten lay buried not just under the desert sands, but under the deliberate, systematic erasure carried out by the pharaohs who followed him. His name was scraped from the king lists, his city was abandoned to the wind, and his revolutionary god was forgotten, a bizarre footnote intentionally omitted from the grand narrative of Egyptian history. It would take the curiosity of the modern world and the trowels of archaeologists to rescue the heretic pharaoh from this state of non-existence, a rediscovery that began not with a royal tomb, but with a chance find by a local woman in the 1880s. The site we now know as Tel El Amarna, the location of Akhenaten's capital city of Akhetaten, sits on the east bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between Cairo and Luxor. For centuries, it was just a vast, desolate field of ruins, its broken stones known to nearby villagers as a place to dig for sebak, the nitrogen-rich decayed mud brick used as fertilizer. It was during this mundane activity that the first clues emerged. Workers began to uncover a series of mysterious, beautifully carved limestone blocks unlike any ever seen before. These blocks showed scenes of a royal family in a strangely fluid and naturalistic style, worshipping a sun disk whose rays ended in tiny hands. The figures had elongated heads and soft, curving bodies. The inscriptions bore names no Egyptologist recognized: Akhenaten and Nefertiti. These were the talatat, the small, easily transportable blocks Akhenaten used to rapidly build his temples, which had been systematically dismantled by Horemheb and used as filler in later constructions. Their discovery sent a shockwave through the world of Egyptology. An entire, unknown chapter of pharaonic history was literally being pulled from the foundations of the known monuments. The true systematic excavation of Amarna began in earnest with the pioneering work of the great British archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie in the winter of 1891. Petrie, a man renowned for his meticulous methodology and scientific approach, was initially baffled by what he found. He wrote of the site's unique and chaotic plan, so different from the orderly religious centers of Thebes. His team uncovered the vast, open-air Great Temple of the Aten, a structure with no roof and hundreds of offering altars, confirming the radical departure from traditional, enclosed temple design. Petrie meticulously mapped the entire city, revealing the grand north-south Royal Road, the distinct residential suburbs for nobles and workers, and the sprawling official palaces. It was under his direction that the now famous bust of Nefertiti, crafted by the sculptor Thutmose, was discovered, though its true significance wouldn't be understood until later. Petrie's work provided the first comprehensive picture of Akhenaten's capital, proving it was not a myth but a massive, fully functioning city built at incredible speed. He recognized he was excavating the remains of a profound religious revolution, piecing together a history that had been condemned to oblivion. His publications introduced the world to the Amarna period and the strange, beautiful, and unsettling art that defined it, forcing scholars to completely rethink their understanding of Egyptian cultural and religious development. The next major leap forward came with the German Oriental Society, led by Ludwig Borchardt, whose excavations from 1911 to 1914 unearthed some of the most iconic treasures of the age. It was in the workshop of the royal sculptor Thutmose in December of 1912 that Borchardt's team made the discovery that would immortalize the Amarna period in the public imagination. There, lying in a room, was the painted limestone bust of Queen Nefertiti, a masterpiece of artistry that captured an elegance and sophistication that felt miraculously modern. The find was so stunning that Borchardt was later accused of deliberately obscuring its value to smuggle it out of Egypt, a controversy that continues to this day. But beyond this single, famous object, the German excavations were critically important. They uncovered the elaborate North Palace, likely belonging to one of Akhenaten's daughters, with its vibrant frescoes of marshlands and wildlife celebrating the Aten's creative power. They also found the royal tomb of Akhenaten, cut deep into a remote eastern valley. The tomb had been brutally desecrated in antiquity, its reliefs defaced and the royal sarcophagus smashed, a final act of vengeance by the restorers of the old order. Yet, its discovery confirmed the location of Akhenaten's intended burial place and provided vital clues about his funerary beliefs, which intriguingly seemed to blend his new solar theology with faint echoes of the traditional Assyrian afterlife he had publicly rejected. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, excavations at Amarna have continued to refine our understanding, moving beyond the search for spectacular art to answer deeper questions about daily life and the ultimate failure of the king's grand experiment. The work of the Egypt Exploration Society under directors like John Pendlebury and more recently Barry Kemp has been instrumental in this regard. Kemp's long-running project, beginning in the 1970s, has employed a deeply holistic approach using aerial photography, soil analysis, and the careful study of common household waste to reconstruct the lives of the ordinary people who built and inhabited the city. Their excavations of the workmen's village, a secluded settlement for the tomb builders, revealed a society under immense strain. The skeletal remains show evidence of malnutrition, stunted growth, and back-breaking labor, painting a picture far removed from the idyllic life portrayed in official art. The city's breadbasket was found to be inefficient and poorly located, suggesting that even basic food supplies were a constant challenge. This archaeological evidence provides a powerful, tangible counter-narrative to the royal propaganda. It suggests that Akhenaten's dream city was for many a place of hardship and scarcity, a capital built so rapidly and so single-mindedly that its fundamental infrastructure and long-term sustainability were tragically neglected. The empty granaries and overworked bodies uncovered by modern archaeologists tell a story of a revolution that failed not just spiritually, but logistically, collapsing under the weight of its own impractical ambition. These ongoing excavations continue to yield surprises, forcing us to constantly revise what we know. The discovery of multiple cemeteries, including the South Tombs Cemetery where the non-elite were buried, has provided a grim demographic snapshot. The analysis shows a shockingly high mortality rate among young adults and teenagers, with many suffering from injuries related to heavy labor. This wasn't a utopia, it was a city that consumed its own people. Furthermore, recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have hinted at still-hidden structures, including what may be an undiscovered royal tomb, sparking new waves of speculation and investigation. Each season in the sand at Amarna chips away at the 3,000-year-old wall of silence erected by Akhenaten's enemies. The broken pottery, the faint outlines of mud brick walls, and the bones of the citizens themselves are now speaking, offering a more nuanced and deeply human story than the one carved on the official monuments. The archaeological resurrection of Akhenaten is a testament to the fact that no memory can be entirely erased. The heretic pharaoh who sought to impose his singular truth upon the world has been brought back into the light not by his followers, but by the patient, persistent science of archaeology, which has given his failed dream, his family, and his people a voice once more. Yet the story of the heretic pharaoh did not end with the chisels of Hormheb or the crumbling of his desert capital. Akhenaten's legacy, forcibly buried for millennia, has experienced a remarkable resurrection in the modern imagination, his life of radical belief and tumultuous rebellion proving an irresistible muse for artists, composers, and filmmakers. His narrative offers a potent cocktail of elements that speak directly to contemporary sensibilities. The lone visionary challenging a powerful and corrupt institution, the enigmatic power couple at the heart of a religious revolution, and the profound, haunting mystery of a lost city and a shattered dream. This transition from historical outcast to cultural icon began in earnest with the archaeological rediscoveries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As the world first laid eyes on the elongated, androgynous forms in the Amarna art and learned the story of the sun-worshipping king, Akhenaten was suddenly reborn not as a villain, but as a fascinating, misunderstood figure, a protester against conformity whose story resonated with a modern world itself grappling with questions of faith, authority, and individual expression. One of the most profound and immersive modern engagements with the pharaoh's story is Philip Glass's 1984 opera, Akhenaten. As part of his portrait trilogy of groundbreaking figures alongside Einstein and Gandhi, Glass places Akhenaten in the company of other 20th century icons who fundamentally altered humanity's perception of the world. The opera is a masterpiece of minimalist music, its repetitive, hypnotic structures and slowly shifting harmonic patterns creating a soundscape that feels both ancient and utterly modern. The music itself seems to mimic the unblinking, cyclical journey of the sun across the sky, immersing the audience in the very rhythm of the Aten. Glass makes the brilliant decision to set much of the libretto in the original languages of the period, Egyptian, Akkadian, and Biblical Hebrew, drawing directly from the Amarna letters and the great hymn to the Aten. This linguistic authenticity elevates the work from a simple retelling to a powerful, almost ritualistic invocation. The audience doesn't just watch the story, they are enveloped in its atmosphere, experiencing the awe and the isolation of Akhenaten's vision. The opera's famous hymn scene, where the pharaoh and his family slowly juggle glowing golden orbs in a breathtaking display of stagecraft, translates the abstract theology of the sun's rays into a wordless, mesmerizing ballet of light and motion, capturing the sublime beauty and the immense strangeness of the Amarna revolution in a way that words alone never could. Beyond the opera house, Akhenaten and Nefertiti have become fertile ground for historical novelists who use the gaps in the historical record as a canvas for exploring deep human dramas. Writers like Pauline Jedge in her novel The 12th Transforming and Naguib Mahfouz in his Akhenaten, Dweller in Truth, approach the pharaoh not as a monolithic heretic or a flawless prophet, but as a complex, psychologically rich individual. Mahfouz's novel is particularly ingenious, structured as a series of conflicting testimonies from those who knew Akhenaten, his mother, Queen Tiye, his general Hormheb, his courtiers, and his priests. Each narrator presents a radically different version of the king. To one, he is a saintly visionary, to another, a mad tyrant, to a third, a manipulated pawn. This Rashomon-like technique brilliantly reflects the core mystery of the historical Akhenaten himself. There is no single truth to be found, only a collection of perspectives, and the reader is left to navigate the murky waters of memory, bias, and survival, understanding that the man is ultimately defined by the contradictions he inspired. These novels explore the intimate human costs of his revolution, the personal betrayals, the shattered family loyalties, and the terrifying weight of absolute power wielded in the name of an absolute truth. The allure of Amarna has naturally extended to the silver screen, though capturing its unique blend of theology and drama presents a distinct challenge. While no major blockbuster has yet centered entirely on Akhenaten, he and his family frequently appear as pivotal figures in films about his most famous son, Tutankhamun. In these portrayals, Akhenaten is often depicted as the source of the kingdom's decay, a fanatical and sickly ruler whose neglect has left a broken empire for the boy king to repair. His legacy hangs over the narrative like a sinister ghost, the dangerous experiment that must be corrected. Visually, cinema has the power to bring the stark, surreal landscape of Amarna to life, contrasting the sun-bleached, open-plan city with the dark, crowded temples of Thebes. The distinctive Amarna art style, with its flowing lines and intimate family portraits, provides a rich visual vocabulary for filmmakers to distinguish Akhenaten's court from any other period in Egyptian history. These portrayals, even when simplified for a mass audience, succeed in communicating the core, compelling tension of his reign, the breathtaking audacity of a man who tried to remake the world, and the devastating price his people paid for his dream. This enduring fascination across diverse media forms speaks to something deeper than just a compelling historical plot. Akhenaten serves as a powerful archetype, a blank screen upon which every era can project its own preoccupations. In the 19th century, early Egyptologists, influenced by their own Christian worldview, often saw him as a noble precursor to Moses, a monotheistic martyr. In the 20th century, as psychoanalysis rose to prominence, he became a case study in the psychological effects of absolute power and perhaps bodily insecurity. In our own time, he can be seen as a radical environmentalist, worshipping the tangible power of nature, or as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideological purity and the rejection of established traditions. His story is endlessly adaptable because its core components are universal. The conflict between innovation and tradition, the relationship between political and religious power, and the eternal question of whether a visionary who destabilizes the world is a hero or a madman. The artists and writers who resurrect him are, in a way, continuing the work of the ancient chiselers, but in reverse. Where Horemheb sought to erase his memory, modern creators are reassembling the pieces, not to arrive at a single definitive truth, but to explore the enduring, haunting power of a pharaoh who looked at 1,000 gods and dared to believe that only one was real. Despite the decades of excavation and scholarly detective work, the sand of Amarna still holds its most profound secrets close. For every answer we uncover, a dozen new, more tantalizing questions seem to emerge from the ruins, reminding us that the story of the heretic pharaoh is a puzzle with many pieces still missing. The silence surrounding the final fate of its central characters is perhaps the most haunting mystery of all. We know the royal family dominated the stage for a dramatic 17-year performance, but the final act, the final exits, the ultimate resting places remains shrouded in a darkness that even the Aten's rays cannot penetrate. Consider the enigma of Nefertiti's final years and her ultimate disappearance. One moment she is a constant, powerful presence, depicted as a pharaoh's equal in scale and authority, performing rituals and driving her own chariot. Then, around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, the documentary evidence for her simply vanishes. She is no longer mentioned in inscriptions, and her unique, graceful form disappears from the reliefs. What could have happened to the woman who was so integral to the revolution's very identity? The most dramatic theory suggests she fell from grace, banished from court for reasons lost to history. Perhaps a political struggle or a personal rift with Akhenaten led to her disgrace. Another possibility is that she succumbed to the same plague or illness that seems to have swept through the royal family during this turbulent period. Yet the most compelling and widely debated hypothesis is that she didn't vanish at all, but transformed. As we've explored, many Egyptologists now posit that she became the co-regent Smenkhkare, ruling alongside her husband and then briefly alone after his death. If this is true, her disappearance as Nefertiti was merely a political and spiritual rebirth, a necessary step to assume the full mantle of pharaonic power in a time of crisis. But without a clear, unequivocal inscription confirming this, her fate remains one of history's most captivating cold cases. This mystery is inextricably linked to the tragic and unresolved deaths within the royal household. The Amarna period is marked by a series of personal losses that must have shaken the regime to its core. We know that Akhenaten's mother, the formidable Queen Tiye, died and was initially buried in his royal tomb at Amarna. His secondary wife, Kia, who may have been the mother of Tutankhamun, also vanishes from the record. Most poignantly, several of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's own daughters seem to have predeceased their parents. Evidence from the royal tomb suggests the burial of at least one young princess, Akhetaten. The cause of these deaths is a complete blank in the historical record. Was it a genetic disorder, a contagion that swept through the isolated capital, or something more sinister? The concentrated timing of these losses paints a picture of a palace in mourning, a family that believed itself divinely blessed yet was repeatedly visited by personal tragedy. This string of deaths would have had dire political consequences, destabilizing the royal lineage and leaving no clear, mature heir from the direct line to securely continue the Amarna experiment, a vulnerability that the old guard was quick to exploit. Then there is the ultimate archaeological cliffhanger, the lost tombs of the royal couple themselves. Akhenaten's tomb was discovered in a remote valley east of his city, but it was a site of brutal desecration. The sarcophagus was shattered into countless pieces, the gold leaf ripped from its surface, and the canopic jars holding his organs were deliberately smashed. His mummy was utterly destroyed or removed, leaving no physical trace of the man himself. The tomb's reliefs were systematically defaced, a final, violent act of condemnation. The fate of Nefertiti's body is an even greater enigma. Her beautiful, unfinished tomb in Amarna was never used, so where was she laid to rest? The most thrilling modern theory, proposed by the renowned Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, suggests her burial might have been hiding in plain sight all along. Reeves, upon analyzing high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, detected what he believes are the outlines of sealed doorways behind the painted walls. He posits that Tutankhamun's small, famously rich tomb was actually a hastily adapted antechamber to a larger, original tomb belonging to Nefertiti, who was buried there during her brief reign as pharaoh. If correct, this would be the archaeological discovery of the century, finally bringing the heretic queen out of the shadows. While initial radar scans have yielded inconclusive and debated results, the possibility continues to electrify the world of Egyptology, a tantalizing promise that the sands may yet give up their most prized secret. These unanswered questions are not merely academic footnotes, they are the very essence of the Amarna story. The gaps in our knowledge force us to engage with the evidence we have in more creative and critical ways. They remind us that history is not a settled fact but an ongoing conversation, a dynamic process of interpretation and reinterpretation. Every new technological advance, from ground-penetrating radar to DNA analysis, offers a fresh chance to interrogate the silent stones and fragmented bones. The enduring mystery of Amarna is a powerful invitation. It invites us to look at a defaced relief and imagine the face that was there. It asks us to read between the lines of a hymn and hear the voice of the man who composed it. It challenges us to stand in the ruins of a desert city and feel the ghost of a dream that dared to reshape heaven and earth. The story of Akhenaten is far from over. With every passing season, the desert whispers that there is still more to tell. And so, the blazing disk of the Aten finally set, leaving behind not the eternal day its prophet had promised, but a profound and unsettling twilight. The story of Akhenaten is one of history's most breathtaking paradoxes, a legacy built on both shattered stone and indestructible ideas. He was, without question, a revolutionary. He gazed upon a civilization held together by the intricate threads of 1,000 gods, and with the absolute power of his office, attempted to cut them all except one. In his radical vision of a single, universal creator, expressed with such beautiful clarity in the great hymn, we see a mind that leaped centuries ahead of its time, a spiritual innovator who challenged humanity to consider a simpler, more direct connection to the divine force behind the natural world. He dared to imagine a different truth and possessed the terrifying will to try and make it real, reshaping art, architecture, and the very soul of his nation in a frantic 17-year blaze of conviction. Yet this same story stands as one of history's most stark cautionary tales. The man who sought to bring his people closer to God ultimately built the highest possible wall between them, positioning himself as the sole, unapproachable conduit for divine grace. His pursuit of a purer truth was enforced with the ruthless efficiency of a police state, sending chisel-wielding crews to scrape the names of beloved deities from tomb walls, silencing the prayers that had comforted generations and leaving his people in a spiritual void. While he composed hymns in his isolated desert capital, the empire his ancestors built began to crumble at the edges, its foreign alliances neglected and its borders growing weak. The visionary was also the fanatic, the reformer was also the tyrant. His revolution reminds us that the line between profound insight and dangerous obsession is perilously thin, especially when it is drawn by someone who believes their own understanding of the divine is infallible. Centuries later, we are left to sift through the sands of Amarna, trying to grasp the full weight of this incredible story. Was Akhenaten a hero who saw a transcendent truth that his people were not ready to accept? Was he a villain whose ego and neglect brought a mighty kingdom to the brink of ruin? Or was he something else entirely, a tragic figure, a product of a system of absolute power that allowed a single man's personal revelation to override the accumulated wisdom and deep-seated beliefs of an entire culture? His legacy is a permanent question mark etched into the stones of Egypt, forcing us to confront the complex relationship between religious belief and political power, and the immense human cost that can accompany a radical dream of heaven on earth. His city is gone, his God is forgotten, and his body is lost, but the echo of his daring question, what if everything we believe is wrong, refuses to fade? So we turn this question over to you as we ponder the shadow of this most enigmatic pharaoh. When you weigh his beautiful hymns against his brutal methods, his visionary ideas against his disastrous rule, what is your final verdict? What do you think? Was Akhenaten a hero, a villain, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries.